The bitter Wyoming wind cut through the gathered crowd like a cavalry saber, sharp and unforgiving. 50 men stood huddled in Rock Creek's muddy town square, their breath forming clouds in the January air of 1876. At their center, a crude gallows had been hastily constructed, little more than a wagon with a noose dangling from a crossbeam. Sheriff Maxwell Hayes adjusted his bowler hat against the wind, his face flushed with whiskey and righteousness. At 45, he commanded the respect of most men in the territory, not through badge or law, but through ownership of the bank that held their mortgages and the saloon that dulled their sorrows. "Let this be a lesson," Hayes bellowed, his voice carrying across the square. "Horse thieves will find no sanctuary in Rock Creek." The condemned man stood with his hands bound behind his back, a burlap sack covering his head. His shoulders remained square despite the jeers of the crowd. This was no common criminal. His posture spoke of education and dignity, even at the threshold of death. "Hang him! String him up!" voices called from the crowd. The drumbeat of approaching hoofbeats silenced them all. A rider approached from the east, tall in the saddle atop a midnight black stallion. As he entered the square, the crowd parted like water before the prow of a ship. The rider wore no badge, but authority hung about him as naturally as the army-issue colt at his hip. "That's far enough, Hayes," the rider called, his voice low, but carrying the weight of command. Hayes squinted against the winter sun. "This ain't your concern, Rollins. Justice is being served." Captain Ethan Rollins dismounted in one fluid motion, a testament to years spent in the saddle. At 38, his face was weathered by sun and wore deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much death. The left sleeve of his coat hung slightly empty at the forearm, where a Confederate mini-A ball had taken its toll at Gettysburg. "Justice requires a trial," Rollins said, approaching the gallows with measured steps. "Where's the judge? The jury? We don't need formalities for a horse thief caught red-handed," Hayes spat. Rollins stopped at the foot of the gallows. "Then you won't mind if I see the evidence for myself." Without waiting for permission, he climbed the steps and removed the burlap sack from the condemned man's head. The prisoner blinked in the harsh light. He was perhaps 50, with intelligent eyes and a closely trimmed silver beard. No common thief, despite his current predicament. "What's your name?" Rollins asked quietly. "Daniel Bennett," the man replied, his Boston accent stark against the frontier drawls surrounding them. "I'm an attorney from Massachusetts." Hayes laughed. "A fine story. He was caught with Simmons's prize mare 2 nights ago, riding hard for the territorial line." Rollins studied Bennett's face. "Is this true?" "I purchased that horse legally from a man claiming to be its owner," Bennett replied steadily. "I have the bill of sale in my coat pocket." Before Hayes could object, Rollins reached into the man's pocket and withdrew a folded document. He read it carefully, then held it up for the crowd to see. "This appears legitimate, bearing the signature of one Thomas Hayes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "My brother," Hayes sputtered, his face reddening further. "Thomas wouldn't sell Simmons's horse." "Perhaps not," Rollins agreed. "But it raises reasonable doubt, and in a proper court, that's enough to stay an execution." "We don't answer to Eastern courts out here," Hayes shouted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Rollins turned to face the crowd. "Many of you fought in the war, Union and Confederate both. What did we fight for, if not to uphold the law of this land? Are we men of principle or animals in the wilderness?" Several of the older men nodded, some touching the brims of their hats, in unconscious respect for the uniform Rollins no longer wore, but somehow still inhabited. "There will be a proper trial," Rollins announced, his tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Bennett will be held until Judge Morrison returns next month." Hayes stepped forward, hand hovering near his pistol. "And who'll guarantee he doesn't escape in the meantime?" "I will," Rollins said simply. "He'll stay at Lone Pine under my supervision." For a moment, Hayes seemed ready to challenge him. Then his banker's instinct for self-preservation prevailed. "On your head be it, Captain," he said, emphasizing the military title with mockery. "If he runs, you'll hang in his place." Rollins cut Bennett's bonds with a single slash of his hunting knife. "I'll take that responsibility." And as they descended the gallows steps, Bennett whispered, "Thank you. Not many would risk their reputation for a stranger." "I'm not risking it for you," Rollins replied, his voice hardened by a decade of command. "I'm doing it for the law." What Rollins couldn't admit even to himself was that he was also doing it for the ghosts. The faces of men who had died under his orders at Antietam and Cold Harbor. The memories of justice abandoned in the chaos of war. And most of all, for Sarah and little James, whose graves on the hill behind his ranch house stood as silent reminders of all he had failed to protect. The journey to Lone Pine Ranch stretched 16 miles through snow-dusted prairie. They rode in silence for the first hour, Rollins leading the way with Bennett, following on a borrowed mare. The lawyer seemed content to respect his rescuer's taciturn nature. As they crested a ridge overlooking the Powder River Valley, Bennett finally spoke. "You have quite a reputation in these parts, Captain Rollins." "Just Rollins. I haven't been captain for 11 years. Old habits?" Bennett nodded. "They say you were the youngest captain in the 12th Pennsylvania. Distinguished service at Gettysburg." Rollins's jaw tightened. "War records aren't worth the paper they're printed on." "Perhaps. But they also say you've built the largest ranch in the territory since returning. 5,000 acres, if rumors are correct." "Land's cheap when no one wants it," Rollins replied flatly. Bennett studied the distant mountains. "Yet, you built something while others merely survived. That takes vision, determination." "It takes work," Rollins corrected. "Nothing more." They rode in silence again until the ranch came into view, a sprawling main house of hewn timber surrounded by barns, bunkhouses, and corrals that spoke of prosperity carved from wilderness. Smoke curled from 3 stone chimneys, promising warmth against the approaching dusk. As they neared the main house, a woman emerged onto the porch. Mrs. Henderson had managed Rollins's household since his return from the war. Her iron-gray hair and ramrod posture, testament to her own battles, survived. She raised an eyebrow at the sight of Bennett, but asked no questions as she took their horses. "Prepare the east room," Rollins instructed. "Mr. Bennett will be staying with us until the circuit judge returns." "Another stray?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her Scottish brogue thickening with disapproval. "A guest," Rollins corrected firmly. Inside the house revealed comforts unexpected on the frontier. Persian rugs, leather-bound books, and oil paintings that suggested civilization hadn't been entirely abandoned. Bennett took it all in with silent appreciation. "You'll be comfortable here," Rollins said, gesturing to a wingback chair before the hearth. "But make no mistake, attempt to leave without my permission, and I'll track you myself." Bennett settled into the chair with a sigh. "I have no intention of running, Captain, particularly since I'm innocent of any crime." "So you maintain?" "So I can prove given time." Bennett hesitated. "Though I confess, my presence in Rock Creek wasn't merely coincidence. I came west looking for someone." Rollins poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "And who might that be?" "A man who saved my life at Gettysburg." a Union officer who stood between Confederate rifles and a field hospital where I lay wounded. Bennett accepted the whiskey with a nod of thanks. I never knew his name, but I never forgot his face. Something cold settled in Rollins's stomach. Many men fought at Gettysburg. Indeed, but I've spent years searching for this particular soldier. Bennett sipped his whiskey. I believe he now serves as Maxwell Hays' right hand. A man called Colonel Edward Wade. The crystal tumbler in Rollins's hand cracked, sending a thin line of whiskey down his wrist. You know him, Bennett observed quietly. Wade is no hero, Rollins said, his voice tight. Whatever debt you think you owe him, forget it. You served together. Once, Rollins set down his damaged glass. That was another lifetime. Before Bennett could press further, Mrs. Henderson entered with a tray of food. The conversation turned to more immediate concerns of shelter and sustenance, but the name hung between them like gun smoke after a duel. Edward Wade, the best friend Rollins had ever known, the worst betrayal he had ever suffered, and somehow the key to whatever had brought Daniel Bennett to Wyoming. That night Rollins stood on his porch, watching snow begin to fall in the moonlight. The cold air cleared his head, but did nothing to quiet the memories Bennett's arrival had stirred. Wade had been his lieutenant during the war, a brilliant tactician with a reckless streak. They had saved each other's lives a dozen times across bloody fields, from Bull Run to Gettysburg. Brothers in all but blood, until Rollins discovered Wade leading a squad to requisition valuables from civilian homes near Petersburg. Wade had called it the spoils of war. Rollins had called it theft. The confrontation that followed left 2 soldiers dead, and Wade with a court-martial recommendation that mysteriously disappeared before reaching headquarters. Wade had been transferred instead, and Rollins hadn't seen him since, until 3 years ago when Wade appeared in Rock Creek as Hays's enforcer. They had avoided each other since an unspoken agreement to leave the past buried. But if Bennett was investigating Hays and Wade was involved, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Rollins from his thoughts. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, his horse lathered despite the cold. "Mr. Rollins?" the young man called, dismounting awkwardly. He was barely 20, with the earnest face of a ranch hand. "Mrs. Henderson said I'd find you out here." "What is it, Tom?" Rollins recognized him as one of the McAllister boys from the neighboring spread. "Indians, sir," Tom panted. "A band of Cheyenne camped in the north pasture." Cheyenne? Rollins frowned. Most of the northern Cheyenne had been forced onto reservations after Little Bighorn last year. "How many?" "Maybe 15. They've got women and children with them." Tom twisted his hat nervously. "Pa sent me to warn you. Sheriff Hays is organizing a militia to drive them off tomorrow." Rollins' jaw tightened. "Those are treaty lands. If they're peaceful, Hays has no authority there." "Yes, sir, but after Little Bighorn." Tom left the implication hanging. Any Indian presence near white settlements sparked fear these days. "Thank your father for the warning," Rollins said. "I'll ride out at first light." After Tom departed, Rollins returned inside to find Bennett sitting before the fire, a blanket draped across his lap, and Rollins's copy of the Iliad open in his hands. "Trouble?" Bennett asked, noting Rollins's expression. "Nothing that concerns you." Rollins poured himself another whiskey. Bennett marked his place in the book. "I couldn't help overhearing. Cheyenne on your land. On unceded territory that adjoins my northern boundary," Rollins corrected. "Hays will use any excuse to start trouble with the Indians. Makes him look strong to the townspeople. And gives him a pretext to claim more land," Bennett added shrewdly. Rollins shot him a sharp look. You seem remarkably well informed for a recent arrival. I've been investigating Hayes and his associates for nearly 6 months, Bennett admitted. Land fraud primarily. They've been manipulating the Homestead Act, forcing legitimate settlers off their claims through intimidation or falsified paperwork. That's a serious accusation, with serious evidence to support it. Bennett leaned forward. I represent several displaced families seeking justice, but Hayes has the local authorities in his pocket. So you came west yourself? Bennett nodded. Someone had to document the pattern of fraud, but I'm afraid my cover was blown. That horse theft accusation was merely a convenient way to eliminate me. Rollins studied the lawyer carefully. Why tell me this? Because tomorrow you'll ride out to those Cheyenne and you'll find their leader is a man called Thomas Iron Wolf. Bennett's eyes held Rollins. He's been helping me gather evidence among the tribes who've lost land to Hayes' schemes. The name struck Rollins like a physical blow. Thomas Iron Wolf had fought alongside him in the war, one of the few Cheyenne scouts who served with the Union forces. They had saved each other's lives more than once. If that's true, Rollins said slowly, why didn't Iron Wolf come to me directly? Because your name appears on several of the questionable land transfers, Bennett said quietly. He wasn't certain which side you were on. The accusation hung in the air like a drawn knife. Rollins set down his glass with deliberate care. I've never taken land that wasn't rightfully purchased, he said, each word precise. Every acre of lone pine was bought legally from the territorial authority. I believe you, Bennett said, but someone has been using your reputation and occasionally forging your signature to legitimize their schemes. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves like a wounded animal. Rollins moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had become his refuge after the war. After Sarah and James died of fever while he was away purchasing the adjacent Johnson property. After he'd buried them on the hill behind the house beneath the lone pine that gave the ranch its name. If what you're saying is true, he said finally, then someone close to me is involved. I believe so. Bennett's reflection in the window glass looked grim. And I have reason to suspect they're planning something bigger than land fraud, something that could spark a war with the remaining free tribes. Rollins turned. What exactly? Bennett reached into his boot and withdrew a folded paper. This map was in Hayes' office. It shows planned diversions of the Powder River and its tributaries. If completed, these dams would leave the northern reservation without water, forcing the tribes to either die of thirst or leave the reservation, giving Hayes' militia an excuse to slaughter them as hostiles. Rollins examined the map, his military training immediately recognizing the strategic implications. This is genocide disguised as progress. Precisely, and the army would be complicit, believing they were simply defending settlers against Indian aggression. Rollins folded the map carefully. You've taken a significant risk bringing this to me. I needed an ally with influence in the territory, Bennett admitted. When I learned of your military record and your fair dealings with the tribes, I hoped. A gunshot cracked through the night, shattering the window beside them. Rollins tackled Bennett to the floor as a second shot splintered the door frame. It seems my presence here hasn't gone unnoticed. Bennett gasped. Rollins crawled to a cabinet, retrieving a Winchester repeating rifle. Stay down and away from the windows. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the hallway door, remarkably composed, despite the gunfire, a shotgun braced against her hip. Back door's secure, she reported. James and the boys are checking the perimeter. Good. Rollins chambered around. Get Bennett to the cellar. I can help, Bennett protested. You can help by staying alive to testify, Rollins countered. Another shot thudded into the outer wall. Rollins moved to the window in a crouch, peering carefully around the frame. In the moonlight, he could make out 3 riders circling the house at a distance, firing sporadically. Not a serious attack, he murmured. Just a warning. They know I'm here, Bennett said grimly. Indeed, they do. Rollins sighted down his rifle, tracking the nearest rider. He squeezed the trigger once, and the man tumbled from his saddle. The other riders immediately retreated into the darkness. You killed him? Bennett asked. Wounded, Rollins corrected. Shoulder shot. They'll be back with reinforcements. Mrs. Henderson was already moving with the efficiency of a battlefield nurse. I'll prepare the defense. Extra ammunition in the usual places. Rollins nodded. And send Tom McAllister to Iron Wolf's camp. Tell him... He hesitated, then committed. Tell him Broken Knife stands with his brother again. Her eyebrows rose at the use of Rollins's Cheyenne name, but she nodded and departed. Bennett looked at Rollins with new understanding. You were more than just comrades with Iron Wolf. He saved my life at Washita River, Rollins said simply. After the war, I testified before Congress about the massacre of peaceful Cheyenne there. It wasn't well received. That's why you came west, not just for land. To start over. Rollins checked his pistol methodically, but it seems the past is not so easily escaped. Outside, the night had gone quiet, too quiet. The attackers had withdrawn, but Rollins knew from hard experience that silence often preceded the worst violence. We need to move, he decided. They'll return in force, likely at dawn. Where can we go? Bennett asked. If Hayes controls the town. Not to town, to Iron Wolf's camp. Rollins began gathering supplies into a saddlebag. If what you say is true, we need to warn him anyway. Hayes may accelerate his plans once he knows you've survived. Bennett nodded grimly. My daughter is still in danger as well. Rollins paused in his preparations. Your daughter, Clara Bennett. A flash of pain crossed the lawyer's face. She's been working as Hayes's secretary for the past month, copying documents for my case. If he discovers her connection to me, the implications hung in the air between them. She's in the viper's nest, Rollins said quietly. By her own choice. She's as stubborn as her mother was. Pride mingled with fear in Bennett's voice. Clara insisted on helping. She has a personal stake in stopping Hayes. What kind of stake? Bennett hesitated. Her mother was Cheyenne, one of the few survivors of the Sand Creek Massacre. Clara passes for white, which has allowed her to access places I couldn't. Rollins absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. That's how you connected with Iron Wolf. He's her uncle, Bennett confirmed. My late wife's brother. The sound of returning hoofbeats ended their conversation. More riders this time moving with purpose. We leave now, Rollins decided. Through the root cellar. There's a tunnel that comes out near the creek. As they gathered the last essentials, Bennett gripped Rollins's arm. If anything happens to me, promise you'll help Clara. She has all the evidence hidden in Hayes' own house. And the weight of the request settled on Rollins's shoulders, another responsibility, another life dependent on his protection. After Sarah and James, he had sworn never to let anyone close enough to become a vulnerability again. Yet here he was, drawn back into the world's complexities by nothing more than a stubborn sense of justice that the war had failed to kill. I'll find her, Rollins promised, the words binding him as surely as any military oath. Outside, the first light of dawn revealed a dozen riders approaching the house. At their head, rode a tall figure Rollins recognized immediately, the distinctive posture of a cavalry officer, even at a distance. Edward Wade had come to finish what his men had started. And somewhere in Rock Creek, Clara Bennett continued her dangerous masquerade, unaware that her father's cover had been blown. The chessboard was set. The first pieces had moved, and Ethan Rollins, who had sought only peace and isolation after burying his family, found himself drawn inexorably back into a war one fought not with armies, but with secrets, paper, and the lives of innocents caught in the crossfire. The frigid waters of Powder Creek soaked through Rollins's boots as he led Bennett along the stream bed. Dawn painted the eastern sky blood red, a fitting backdrop to the smoke now rising from the direction of Lone Pine Ranch. Wade's men had torched the outbuildings after finding the house empty. "Your people," Bennett panted, struggling to keep pace. "Safe." Rollins's reply was clipped. Mrs. Henderson had standing orders for such emergencies. The ranch hands would scatter, then regroup at a line cabin 20 miles north. "They've seen trouble before." They traveled in tense silence until the sun cleared the horizon. Rollins moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to hostile territory. Eyes constantly scanning for movement, choosing paths that left minimal tracks in the fresh snow. Bennett followed gamely despite his city upbringing, asking no questions that weren't essential. By mid-morning, they had climbed into the foothills where pine forests offered better concealment. Rollins finally called a halt in a sheltered ravine, allowing Bennett to rest. "Iron Wolf's camp is 3 miles northeast," Rollins said, orienting himself by the sun. "But we need to approach carefully. After Little Bighorn, any Cheyenne will shoot first if surprised." Bennett nodded, catching his breath. "I should have brought something to identify myself." "Iron Wolf knows me," Rollins assured him. "Though it's been many years." A twig snapped somewhere to their left. Rollins's hand dropped to his Colt, but he didn't draw. His instincts told him they were already surrounded. "We're being watched," he said quietly. "Don't make any sudden movements." Bennett tensed. "Hayes's men—" "No." Rollins slowly raised his empty hands. "Cheyenne scouts, very good ones." As if summoned by his words, 4 warriors materialized from the forest boughs, drawn and aimed. They wore a mixture of traditional buckskins and cavalry cast-offs, their faces painted for war despite the peace treaties. Rollins addressed them in halting Cheyenne. "I seek Thomas Iron Wolf. I am Broken Knife, who fought beside him against the Gray Coats." The warriors exchanged glances, but kept their weapons trained. The eldest stepped forward, his face deeply lined by sun and hardship. "Broken Knife died at Washita," he said in accented English, "with our women and children." "I survived," Rollins replied, pulling back his left sleeve to reveal the distinctive scar that had earned him his Cheyenne name, a knife wound taken while defending a wounded Iron Wolf. "As did your chief." The warrior studied the scar, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Follow. Make wrong move, you die." They were escorted through the forest in tense silence, eventually emerging into a hidden valley where a small encampment of 15 teepees stood in the traditional circle. Women paused in their work to watch the strangers pass, their faces impassive, but their eyes wary. Children were nowhere to be seen, likely hidden at the first sign of white visitors. At the center of the camp, before the largest teepee, stood a man Rollins would have recognized anywhere. Thomas Iron Wolf had aged since their last meeting, silver streaking his black braids, but his posture remained as straight as the day he'd ridden scout for the 12th Pennsylvania. He wore a mixture of traditional Cheyenne clothing and an officer's greatcoat, a visual representation of the 2 worlds he straddled. Iron Wolf watched them approach his face, betraying nothing until they stood 10 paces apart. Then slowly, He raised his right-hand palm forward in the universal gesture of peace. "Broken knife," he said, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "The white man's world has not yet killed you." "Not for lack of trying," Rollins replied, with the ghost of a smile. Iron Wolf's stoic expression cracked, and he stepped forward to clasp Rollins's forearm in the warrior's grip they had shared so many times on campaign. "It is good to see you, my brother," Iron Wolf said, switching to English for Bennett's benefit, "though your timing suggests trouble follows you still." "Trouble has found us both," Rollins agreed grimly. "This is Daniel Bennett. I believe you know him." Iron Wolf nodded. "The lawyer. We expected you yesterday." "There were complications," Bennett explained. "Sheriff Hayes discovered my purpose. If not for Captain Rollins, I'd be decorating a rope in Rock Creek." Iron Wolf's gaze sharpened. "Hayes moves faster than we anticipated." He gestured toward his teepee. "Come, we have much to discuss." Inside the teepee was warm and surprisingly spacious. A small fire burned in the central pit, and sitting on a buffalo robe beside it was a young Cheyenne woman, perhaps 25, dressed in a calico dress with traditional beadwork. Her features showed the same aristocratic bone structure as Iron Wolf, but her eyes were startlingly green, a genetic heritage from some distant European ancestor. "This is Morning Bird," Iron Wolf introduced her. "My sister's daughter." The woman inclined her head slightly but said nothing. Rollins noted the way her hand rested near a skinning knife at her belt, a warrior's caution, despite her gentle appearance. "Your niece knows our language well," Rollins asked in Cheyenne. "Better than you," she replied in perfect, unaccented English, her voice cultured and educated. "Harvard has an excellent language program." Bennett cleared his throat. "Captain Rollins isn't aware of your particular situation, Morning Bird." The young woman studied Rollins with open assessment. "Can he be trusted?" "With your life," Bennett said firmly. "He saved mine at considerable risk to himself." Morning Bird seemed unconvinced but nodded. "Very well." She reached up and removed what Rollins suddenly realized was a wig of traditional Cheyenne styling, revealing shorter hair beneath. "My name, Captain, is Clara Bennett, and we have a significant problem." Rollins stared at the transformation. The woman before him was Daniel Bennett's daughter, the one supposedly working as Hayes's secretary in Rock Creek. Yet here she sat in a Cheyenne camp, clearly familiar with her surroundings and her uncle. "You're supposed to be in town," he said finally. "I was until yesterday." Clara's voice was clipped efficient. "When Hayes received word that my father had been arrested, I knew my cover would soon be compromised. I escaped before they could connect us." Bennett moved to his daughter's side. "Thank God you're safe. I feared the worst when Rollins told me you were still in Hayes's household." "I managed to secure most of the documents before leaving," Clara said, all business despite the clear affection as she briefly clasped her father's hand. "Land deeds, water rights correspondence with territorial officials. Enough to build a case against Hayes and his associates." "Including Edward Wade?" Rollins asked quietly. Clara's green eyes fixed on him. "Especially Wade. He's the strategist behind their entire operation. Hayes has the money and connections, but Wade provides the military expertise and enforces their will through intimidation." Iron Wolf settled cross-legged by the fire. "Wade is known to our people. He led the cavalry at Sand Creek. My sister was among the few who escaped." "Clara's mother," Bennett added softly. Rollins absorbed this information with growing unease. Wade had never spoken of Sand Creek, though rumors of the massacre had reached even the Eastern armies during the war. Over 200 Cheyenne, mostly women and children, slaughtered despite flying white flags of surrender. Wade was at Sand Creek, he asked, his voice hollow. I never knew. He was a lieutenant then, Iron Wolf confirmed. Before he joined your regiment, I recognized him when he first came to Rock Creek, though he did not know me. The revelation struck Rollins like a physical blow. He had served alongside Wade for 2 years, trusted him with his life, never knowing his hands were stained with the blood of innocence. How many other secrets had his former friend kept? This changes nothing and everything, Rollins said finally. Hayes and Wade must be stopped regardless of past crimes. But now we know this vendetta is personal for Wade. He's built his life on Indian killing. And now he plans his masterpiece, Clara said grimly, unfolding the same map Bennett had shown Rollins. These dam projects would divert the headwaters of 3 rivers that feed the northern reservation. Within 6 months, 8,000 Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho would face starvation and thirst. Forcing them to leave the reservation, Rollins concluded, which would void the treaty protections, Bennett added, making them hostiles under territorial law. Legal extermination, Clara finished, her educated voice at odds with the brutal assessment. Iron Wolf's face remained impassive, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. The dam construction begins in 2 weeks. Hayes has already imported Chinese laborers who arrived on yesterday's train. Rollins studied the map with a tactician's eye. These positions are well chosen. Minimal manpower needed for maximum effect. He looked up at Iron Wolf. How many warriors do you have? 23 who can fight. The rest of our band was forced to the reservation last autumn. Not enough for direct confrontation, Rollins concluded, and violence would only justify Hayes' narrative about savage Indians threatening civilization. We need the law on our side, Bennett insisted. With these documents and my testimony, we could bring federal charges against Hayes and Wade. The nearest federal judge is in Cheyenne, Clara pointed out, 200 miles south. We'd never make it through Hayes's territory without being intercepted. Silence fell as they considered their limited options. Rollins felt the weight of command settling onto his shoulders again, a familiar burden he had thought left behind on the battlefields of Virginia. Lives depended on his decisions once more. We need allies, he said finally. People in Rock Creek who've been harmed by Hayes's operations, but are respected enough that their words carry weight. The widow Larson, Bennett suggested. Hayes foreclosed on her ranch last year. Her husband was a Union colonel. She still has connections in Washington. Reverend Simmons, Clara added. He's been speaking against the saloon's influence on the town's morals. Hayes has tried to run him out twice. Iron Wolf nodded. The reservation agent McPherson. He is a corrupt man, but he fears exposure more than Hayes. He knows about the water diversion plan and disapproves not from humanity, but because dead Indians would end his profitable position. Rollins considered these potential allies. Not enough. We need someone inside Hayes's operation, someone who can verify the documents and testify to their authenticity. That would have been my role, Clara said with frustration before my cover was blown. Perhaps, Bennett hesitated. Perhaps Wade himself. Rollins stared at him. Wade, he's Hayes's right hand. Precisely, and therefore privy to everything. If we could somehow turn him against Hayes. Impossible, Iron Wolf interrupted flatly. Wade is a killer to his core. But he's also a soldier, Rollins said slowly, the beginnings of an idea forming. He lives by a certain code, twisted though it may be. When we served together, Wade valued loyalty above all else. He considered my reporting his crimes the ultimate betrayal, not because he thought himself wrong, but because I had violated our bond as officers. Clara leaned forward. You think his loyalty to Hayes might be similarly conditional? I think Wade serves Wade first, Rollins replied. If he believes Hayes might sacrifice him to save himself, his allegiance could shift. A dangerous game, Bennett warned. If it fails, we lose any advantage of surprise we might have. True, but Rollins was interrupted by a commotion outside the teepee. A moment later, a young Cheyenne warrior burst through the entrance flap. Are riders coming? He reported breathlessly in his native tongue. Many men, white soldiers. Iron Wolf was on his feet instantly. How many? How far? 20, maybe more. 2 miles south and approaching fast. They wear blue coats. Cavalry? Rollins exchanged a grim look with Iron Wolf. Not a coincidence. No, Iron Wolf agreed. Someone has reported our location. How? Clara demanded. No one knew I was coming here. The answer struck Rollins with cold certainty. They followed us. Bennett and me. Wade must have had trackers on our trail. Bennett's face paled. My God, I've led them straight to you. No time for blame, Iron Wolf said briskly. We must move. The women and children first through the northern pass. As the camp erupted into controlled chaos, Rollins pulled Iron Wolf aside. This isn't a normal patrol. Wade is hunting us specifically. You need to scatter, make it impossible to track everyone. Iron Wolf nodded. And you, Bennett and I will lead them away. Create a diversion. Rollins glanced at Clara. Your niece should go with your people. I'm staying with my father, Clara declared, overhearing as she gathered documents into a leather satchel. Clara, Bennett began, I'm not arguing about this. Her tone brooked no dissent. These documents are the only chance we have to stop Hayes legally. I won't risk them being captured. Rollins recognized the futility of arguing with her determined expression. Fine, but you follow my orders without question. Both of you. Iron Wolf clasped Rollins's arm one final time. Like old times, brother, drawing the enemy's fire while others escape. Let's hope it ends better than Washita, Rollins replied grimly. Within minutes, the Cheyenne camp was breaking down with practiced efficiency. Women dismantled teepees, while warriors prepared horses and gathered weapons. Children and elders were already being led into the dense forest to the north, where cavalry horses would struggle to follow. Rollins, Bennett, and Clara mounted horses provided by Iron Wolf's sturdy mustangs bred for endurance rather than speed. We'll head east, Rollins instructed, checking his Winchester's action. Make it obvious. Once the Cheyenne are clear, we'll lose our pursuers in the high country and double back toward Rock Creek. Back to town? Bennett asked incredulously. That's the last place we should go. It's the last place they'll expect us, Rollins countered. And we need those allies we discussed. This changes nothing except our timeline. Clara secured the document satchel to her saddle. He's right, Father. Hayes thinks he has us on the run. That gives us an opportunity to organize resistance where he's most vulnerable. Bennett looked unconvinced but nodded. I'll follow your lead, Captain. Then let's ride, Rollins said, turning his horse toward the eastern trail, and make enough noise for Wade's men to find our trail without trying. They rode hard for an hour, leaving clear tracks in the fresh snow. Twice they spotted dust clouds in the distance, cavalry patrols sweeping the area. Rollins led them on a winding course that kept them just visible enough to be pursued, but never close enough to be caught. By midday, they had drawn the main pursuit force far from Iron Wolf's people. Rollins led them into a narrow canyon where sheer rock walls funneled any followers into a natural ambush point. Dismount, he ordered, leading them to a defensible position among tumbled boulders. We make our stand here. Stand? Bennett looked alarmed. I thought the plan was to evade them. It is, Rollins assured him, positioning his rifle. But first, we need to convince them they've cornered us. When they charge in, we'll slip out the back way while they're pinned down by our covering fire. Clara unslung a carbine from her saddle, a Spencer repeater that had seen hard use. At Rollins's raised eyebrow, she chambered a round with practiced ease. Harvard offers more than just language courses, Captain, she said dryly. Despite the tension, Rollins felt a reluctant admiration. Your father taught you well. My mother, actually, Clara corrected. She believed a woman should know how to defend herself in this world, particularly a woman of mixed blood. Before Rollins could respond, the distant thunder of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. He peered carefully around a boulder. A column of cavalry approached at a trot, a full platoon of 20 men in army blue, led by a figure Rollins recognized instantly. Edward Wade sat tall in the saddle, his officers' bearing unchanged from their days in the 12th Pennsylvania. His black beard was now streaked with gray, and a cavalry major's insignia adorned his uniform, but the cold intensity of his gaze remained exactly as Rollins remembered. That's him? Clara whispered, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Rollins nodded. Major Edward Wade, though I doubt that rank was legitimately earned. He was at Sand Creek, she said so quietly Rollins barely heard. He would have been one of the officers who gave the order to fire on women and children. Clara, Bennett warned, this isn't the time. She subsided, but Rollins noted how her knuckles whitened around the Spencer's stock. Listen carefully, he instructed. When I give the signal, you'll both take the horses through that crevice behind us. It leads to a box canyon with a narrow exit to the north. Follow it until you reach Miller's Creek, then head west. I'll catch up within the hour. You're staying behind, Bennett asked. Just long enough to convince them we're all still here. Rollins checked his ammunition. Wade won't commit his men to a frontal assault if he thinks we're well positioned. He's too good a tactician. And if he recognizes you? Clara asked shrewdly. He will. That's counting on it. Rollins's smile was grim. Old grudges make men careless. The cavalry unit halted at the canyon's mouth 200 yards from their position. Wade dispatched flanking riders to secure the heights on either side, standard military procedure that Rollins had anticipated. Get ready, he murmured. When those scouts reach the ridge, I'll open fire. Not to hit them, but to pin them down. That's when you leave. Clara suddenly gripped his arm. Wait, something's wrong. Rollins followed her gaze. Wade had moved to the front of his column and raised a white handkerchief tied to his saber, the universal signal for parley. Captain Rollins, Wade's voice echoed between the canyon walls. I know you're there. I request a conversation under flag of truce. Bennett tensed. It's a trap. Possibly, Rollins agreed. But Wade respects certain military protocols even now. He wouldn't violate a flag of truce. You can't trust him, Clara insisted. I don't, but I'm curious what he wants badly enough to risk approaching us alone. Wade remained stationary, the white flag clearly visible. After a moment's consideration, Rollins stood keeping his rifle lowered, but ready. I'm here, Major, he called. State your business. Even at this distance, Rollins could see Wade's tight smile. Permission to approach, Captain. I'd prefer not to shout state secrets across a canyon. Rollins hesitated, then nodded. Come ahead, alone and unarmed. Wade dismounted and handed his weapons to a sergeant. He walked forward with the same confident stride Rollins remembered from a dozen battlefields, stopping 30 paces away close enough to speak normally far enough to give Rollins time to shoot, if necessary. "It's been a long time, Ethan," Wade said, using Rollins's given name with deliberate familiarity. "Not long enough, Edward." Rollins kept his tone neutral. "You're looking well for a man who's spent the last decade building a fortune on stolen land and murdered Indians." Wade's smile didn't falter. "Still the righteous Quaker boy, I see. Some things never change. What do you want? To offer you a way out of an impossible situation." Wade gestured toward the canyon rim where more soldiers had appeared. "You're surrounded, outnumbered, and harboring known fugitives from territorial justice. By all rights, I should simply order my men to open fire. Yet, here you are alone and exposed," Rollins observed. "Curious choice for a man holding all the cards. Because unlike Sheriff Hayes, I don't want to see you dead, Ethan." Wade's expression softened fractionally. "Despite our disagreements, we served together. That counts for something in my book. Does it? It didn't seem to at Petersburg." Wade's jaw tightened. "Ancient history. I'm here to offer you a chance at redemption. Return to Lone Pine, rebuild your ranch, and stay out of Hayes's business affairs. In exchange, Bennett will receive safe passage to the territorial border." "And his daughter?" Rollins asked, careful not to reveal whether he knew Clara's location. "The girl is a complication," Wade admitted. "She's taken documents that don't belong to her. Return them, and she can leave with her father." Behind the boulder, Clara stiffened. Bennett placed a restraining hand on her arm. Rollins studied Wade's face, searching for the man he had once called friend. "And the Cheyenne Iron Wolf and his people." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, a coldness Rollins remembered from their final confrontation at Petersburg. "The Indians are not negotiable. They've violated reservation boundaries and will be dealt with accordingly." "You mean slaughtered?" Rollins translated flatly. Wade shrugged. "The West is changing, Ethan. There's no place for savages in civilization's path. You know this as well as I do. You simply lack the courage to admit it." And Hayes's water diversion project, the one designed to starve 8,000 reservation Indians. If Wade was surprised by Rollins's knowledge, he didn't show it. Progress requires sacrifice. Surely the war taught you that. "The war taught me that men justify atrocities by calling them necessity." Rollins's voice hardened. "What happened to you, Edward? You were a good officer once, tough but fair. When did you become this?" For a moment, something like regret crossed Wade's features. "We all make choices, Ethan. After you destroyed my military career, I had to find another path. Hayes offered opportunity when no one else would. And all it cost was your soul." Wade laughed without humor. "Soul. We left those on the killing fields of Antietam, old friend. All that remains is survival and making our mark before the darkness takes us." He extended his hand. "Come back to the winning side. One last time." Rollins stared at the offered hand, remembering a younger Wade extending the same gesture across a campfire the night before Gettysburg. They had sworn to watch each other's backs in the coming battle, a promise they had both kept through the bloodiest fighting of the war. "I can't do that, Edward," he said finally. "Not at the price you're asking." Wade's expression hardened. "Then you've made your choice." He turned to go, then paused. "For what it's worth, I did try to spare Sarah and the boy." Rollins froze. "What did you say?" "The fever that took them," Wade clarified, watching Rollins carefully. "It wasn't coincidence. Hayes needed that Johnson property to control the watershed. When you refused to sell more, direct measures were required. The world seemed to stop around Rollins as the implication sank in. You poisoned the well. Not me personally, Wade said, as if that distinction mattered. But yes, the water source was contaminated. It was meant for you, Ethan. Sarah and little James were collateral damage. War teaches us such phrases to ease our conscience. Rollins's vision narrowed to a red tunnel focused solely on Wade's face. His hand tightened on his rifle, every fiber of his being screaming to end the man standing before him. I tell you this, not out of cruelty. Wade continued, seemingly oblivious to his peril. But so you understand the stakes. Hayes will stop at nothing to complete his vision. If you stand in his way, what happened to your family will seem merciful by comparison. With supreme effort, Rollins mastered the killing rage that threatened to consume him. You've delivered your message, he said, his voice deadly calm. Now get out of my sight before I forget that white flag. Wade studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Goodbye, Ethan. When next we meet, it will be as enemies in truth. He turned and walked unhurriedly back toward his waiting troops. Rollins watched him go, every instinct demanding he raise his rifle and end the threat Wade posed. Only the knowledge that such action would doom Bennett and Clara stayed his hand. When he finally returned to their hiding place, Clara took one look at his face and paled. What happened? Change of plans. Rollins said, his voice like gravel. We're not running anymore. Bennett eyed him warily. What did Wade say to you? He confessed to murdering my wife and son. Rollins checked his weapons with mechanical precision, his movements controlled despite the storm raging within. And in doing so, he sealed his fate and that of Maxwell Hayes. Captain, Bennett began cautiously. Revenge is... This isn't about revenge. Rollins cut him off. It's about justice and ensuring they can never harm another family. Clara studied him with unsettling intensity. What's your plan? Rollins secured his ammunition belt. We're going to Rock Creek, tonight, and we're going to take Hayes's operation apart, piece by piece. That's suicide, Bennett protested. The three of us against Hayes' entire organization. Not just us. Rollins swung into his saddle. Every person Hayes has wronged, every family he's destroyed. By the time we're finished, Maxwell Hayes will beg for the mercy of a hangman's noose. As they prepared to move out through the back of the canyon, Rollins cast one last look at Wade's retreating cavalry column. 3 years he had mourned Sarah and James, blaming himself for being away when illness struck. Now he knew the truth. Their deaths were no act of God or nature, but calculated murder. In that moment, Ethan Rollins felt the last remnants of his post-war peace crumble away. In its place rose something colder and more terrible, the implacable resolve of a soldier with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Rock Creek's lone church bell tolled 9 times its somber resonance, carrying through the winter night. Rollins observed the town from the cover of pine trees on the eastern ridge, counting lamplights and gauging patrols. In the 3 days since their escape from Wade's cavalry, he had transformed from cautious protector to calculating strategist, a change that hadn't gone unnoticed by his companions. You've scouted the town 3 times now, Bennett said quietly, joining him at the ridgeline. What are you looking for that you haven't already seen? Patterns, Rollins replied without turning. Hayes has doubled the guards around his estate and the bank, 4 men at each entrance rotating every 2 hours. That's to be expected given our escape. Yes. Rollins focused his field glass on the saloon where raucous piano music spilled into the street, along with drunken miners and cowboys. But he's left the saloon virtually unprotected. One man at the door, none at the back entrance. Bennett frowned. A trap? No. Arrogance. Rollins lowered the glass. Hayes believes the saloon is his territory. No one in town would dare move against it. That's our way in. Into the saloon. What good does that do us? Hayes keeps his business ledgers in the office above the gaming floor. The real ones, not the doctored versions at the bank. Rollins turned to face Bennett fully. Your daughter confirmed this. Clara had spent the day reconnoitering the town in disguise, using her facility with languages and appearances to gather intelligence while posing as a half-Mexican laundress. She'd returned with detailed information about Hayes's operations' security arrangements, and most valuably, the schedule of the corrupt town marshal, who served as Hayes's primary enforcer within Rock Creek itself. Speaking of Clara, Bennett said, concern evident in his voice. She's been gone too long on this latest errand. Rollins checked his pocket watch. 43 minutes. She said the meeting might take time. Meeting with a man none of us has met, based solely on her assessment that he might help us. Bennett's worry made him querulous. We shouldn't have let her go alone. Your daughter is remarkably capable, Rollins observed, and McPherson would never speak with either of us. Bennett sighed. I know. It's just, she's all I have left, Captain. The simple declaration hung in the cold air between them. Rollins understood all too well the fear of losing one's last connection to humanity. It was that same fear that had driven him into isolation after Sarah and James died, and the same fear that now fueled his determination to bring Hayes and Wade to justice, regardless of the cost. The snap of a twig behind them brought both men around, weapons at the ready. Clara emerged from the darkness, now dressed in the plain clothes of a frontier schoolteacher rather than her laundress disguise. Her face was grim. McPherson won't help us, she reported without preamble. Hayes has already bought him off, doubled his usual bribe. Bennett's shoulders slumped. Then we've lost our inside connection to the reservation agency. Not entirely. Clara removed a folded document from inside her coat. I managed to secure this before leaving. McPherson's official correspondence confirming the water diversion plans would create an untenable situation for the reservation inhabitants. Rollins examined the document. Bureaucratic language for mass death. Precisely. McPherson was careful never to explicitly condemn the plan, but this letter establishes he understood the consequences. Clara's expression remained professionally detached, though Rollins detected the anger she kept carefully controlled. It's not enough on its own, but combined with the other evidence, it helps build our case. Bennett nodded. Well done. But did you secure the room at the boarding house? Rollins asked. Clara nodded. Mrs. Larson was cautious but cooperative. She remembers father from his earlier visits and harbors no love for Hayes after losing her ranch. We have accommodations under false names, a widowed sister, and her brother visiting from Denver with a hired gun for protection. That's our cover to gather allies, Rollins confirmed, starting tonight with Reverend Simmons after evening services. Assuming he agrees to meet us, Bennett cautioned. He will. Clara's confidence was absolute. I attended his sermon this afternoon. He spoke against the money changers and false prophets corrupting Rock Creek. He didn't name Hayes directly, but everyone knew who he meant. Rollins nodded approvingly. Good. We need people of moral authority as well as those with practical grievances. He checked his watch again. The Reverend will finish services in 20 minutes. We should get to the boarding house and prepare. As they gathered their sparse belongings, Rollins found himself studying Clara with newfound respect. In the brief time he'd known her, she had demonstrated intelligence, courage, and adaptability that would have distinguished any frontier scout. That she managed this, while navigating the additional complexities of being a mixed-race woman in a society hostile to both identities, made her accomplishments all the more remarkable. "My uncle taught me," she said quietly, catching his appraising look. "Iron Wolf believed women should know how to survive in both worlds." "He taught you well," Rollins acknowledged. "Your mother would be proud." Something flickered in Clara's green eyes, pain, perhaps, or determination. "When this is finished, Captain, I'd like to hear about the man you knew in the war. The Edward Wade before he became what he is now." The request surprised him. "Why?" "To understand how a man falls so far. To ensure I recognize the signs in others." She secured the document satchel with precise movements. "And perhaps to know if redemption is possible, even for someone like him." Rollins considered her words as they descended toward the town. The question of Wade's corruption had haunted him since their confrontation in the canyon. Had the seeds of monstrosity always been there waiting for the right conditions? Or had his friend truly changed, warped by circumstance and choice, until he became unrecognizable? And if Wade could fall so far, what prevented Rollins himself from following the same dark path in his quest for justice? Mrs. Larson's boarding house sat at the respectable end of Rock Creek's main street, its whitewashed clapboards and neatly curtained windows projecting an air of gentility at odds with the rough frontier town. The widow herself answered their knock, ushering them inside with the practiced discretion of a woman accustomed to minding her own business, a valuable quality in their current circumstances. "Your rooms are ready, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," she said loudly for the benefit of anyone within earshot, referring to Clara and Bennett by their aliases. To Rollins, she added, "And the adjoining room for your man as requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Larson," Bennett replied with appropriate formality. "Has our other associate arrived? The Reverend sent word he'll come by the back entrance after 9:30. She lowered her voice. "I've prepared the parlor for your meeting. No one will disturb you." The rooms were simple but clean, with solid doors and sturdy locks, important considerations for fugitives in hostile territory. Rollins performed a thorough security check, noting potential escape routes and defensible positions with the automatic assessment of a veteran campaigner. At precisely 9:35, Mrs. Larson escorted Reverend Simmons into the private parlor. The minister was younger than Rollins had expected, perhaps 30, with earnest eyes and the determined expression of a reformer. He wore the simple black coat of his calling, though the calluses on his hands suggested he was no stranger to physical labor. "Mrs. Larson says you wish to discuss Maxwell Hayes," Simmons began without preamble once introductions were complete. "I should warn you, I'm not popular with his circle of influence." "That's precisely why we're here," Reverend Bennett explained. "We're building a case against Hayes and his associates for land fraud, water rights manipulation, and other serious crimes." Simmons's eyes widened. "You have evidence of this?" Clara opened the document satchel, displaying the carefully organized contents. Deeds with forged signatures, correspondence with territorial officials documenting bribes, survey maps showing illegal water diversions planned for reservation lands. "My God," Simmons whispered, examining the papers. "I knew Hayes was corrupt, but this is systematic evil." "Evil with a purpose," Rollins added grimly. "Control of water means control of all development in the territory. Within 5 years, Hayes would effectively own every ranch, mine, and business operation dependent on the rivers he's diverting. Not to mention the humanitarian catastrophe on the reservation," Clara said. "Thousands would die of thirst and starvation when their water sources dry up." Simmons looked up sharply. You have proof of this part as well. McPherson's own correspondence, Clara confirmed, indicating the relevant document. He acknowledges the untenable situation while carefully avoiding explicit condemnation. This must be brought to federal authorities immediately, Simmons declared. That's our intention, Bennett agreed. But we need more local support first. Hayes controls the telegraph office and has men watching the stagecoach and rail stations. Any attempt to contact outside authorities would be intercepted. What do you need from me? Simmons asked. Your moral authority, Rollins answered, and your connections to other potential allies in town, people who've been wronged by Hayes but are still respected in the community. Simmons considered this, then nodded decisively. I can help. Several of my congregation have lost land or businesses to Hayes's machinations. Good people who would speak truth if given the chance. And protection, Clara added pointedly. Anyone who stands against Hayes will face retaliation. I understand the risk, Simmons said with quiet dignity. But I didn't come west to watch evil prosper while good men stay silent. They spent the next hour identifying potential allies and planning discreet meetings over the coming days. Simmons proved to have intimate knowledge of the town's social dynamics, who had grievances against Hayes, who could be trusted, who might be persuaded to testify under the right circumstances. As the meeting concluded, Rollins walked Simmons to the back door. We appreciate your courage, Reverend. Simmons paused in the doorway. May I ask a personal question, Mr. Rollins? You may ask. Mrs. Larson mentioned you were once an army officer, that you fought with distinction. That was another life. Yet here you are, risking everything to fight another kind of battle. Simmons studied him thoughtfully. Is it justice you seek, or absolution? The question struck uncomfortably close to Rollins's private thoughts. Does it matter as long as Hayes is stopped? It matters to your soul, Mr. Rollins. Simmons' voice held no judgment, only concern. Vengeance hollows a man from within. Justice fills him with purpose. My soul is my own concern, Reverend, Rollins replied stiffly. Of course. Simmons donned his hat. I'll contact the others we discussed and arrange meetings. God be with you all in this endeavor. After Simmons departed, Rollins remained by the door, turning the minister's words over in his mind. Was it justice he sought, or merely revenge dressed in more respectable clothing? Since Wade's revelation about Sarah and James, the line between the two had blurred in his mind. He means well, Clara said quietly from the parlor doorway, but he doesn't understand what it's like to lose everything. Rollins turned to find her watching him with that same unsettling intensity. And you do. I watched my mother die at Sand Creek, she replied simply. I was 5 years old, hiding beneath her body, as the soldiers searched for survivors to finish off. The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Rollins had heard accounts of Sand Creek's atrocities, but never from a survivor. How did you escape? My father found me afterward. He was a government lawyer investigating reports of Army misconduct. He brought me east, gave me his name, educated me as his daughter. Her voice remained remarkably steady. I've spent my life between worlds, too Indian for white society, too white for my mother's people. Yet you've mastered both, Rollins observed. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Survival requires adaptation, Captain. Surely the war taught you that. Before he could respond, Bennett emerged from the adjoining room, maps spread across his arms. I've been reviewing the water diversion plans, he announced. There's something peculiar about the placement of the main dam. Grateful for the interruption, Rollins turned his attention to the maps. Bennett had identified an anomaly in Hayes's engineering plans. The primary dam was positioned not at the most efficient location for water diversion, but further upstream near an unmarked area of the watershed. "It's inefficient for irrigation," Bennett explained, indicating the elevations. "Building here would require significantly more materials and labor." Clara studied the map, her brow furrowing. Unless water diversion isn't the only purpose. "What do you mean?" Rollins asked. "The Powder River headwaters were the site of a major gold strike in '68, she explained. It played out quickly and was abandoned, but local legends persist that the main vein was never found." Bennett's eyes widened in understanding. "You think Hayes is using the dam project as cover for reopening the mine?" "It would explain the positioning," Clara confirmed, "and the excessive security we've observed around the construction site." Rollins considered this new information. If true, it changes things. Water rights violations are serious, but gold on reservation land would bring federal marshals immediately. "And federal marshals are exactly what we need," Bennett said eagerly. "If we can document the mining operation—" "We'd need proof," Rollins cautioned. "Actual evidence, not just suspicious dam placements." Clara closed the map decisively. "Then we'll get proof. The construction site is 12 miles north. With good horses, we could reach it by dawn, observe their operations, and be back before anyone realizes we've been there." "Too risky," Bennett protested. "Wade's men are patrolling all approaches to the reservation boundary." "Which is why they won't expect us to head directly toward it," Clara countered. "Sometimes the boldest move is the safest." Rollins found himself nodding in agreement. "She's right. Hayes is watching the roads east and south, expecting us to flee the territory. He won't have as many men guarding the construction site itself." "It's still a tremendous risk," Bennett insisted. "Every hour we delay gives Hayes more time to cover his tracks," Rollins pointed out. "If Clara's right about the gold mine, this could be the evidence that breaks his entire operation." After further discussion, they formulated a plan. Rollins and Clara would ride to the construction site that night, while Bennett remained in Rock Creek to continue gathering allies through Reverend Simmons's connections. If they weren't back by the following sunset, Bennett would assume they'd been captured and proceed with contingency plans to get the existing evidence to the territorial governor. As Clara prepared for the expedition, checking weapons and gathering supplies with quiet efficiency, Rollins found Bennett watching her with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "She's too much like her mother," the lawyer said softly. "Brave to the point of recklessness." "You raised a remarkable woman," Rollins offered. Bennett's smile was tinged with sadness. "I merely nurtured what was already there. The courage, the intelligence, those she inherited from Spotted Fawn." He turned to Rollins with sudden intensity. "If anything happens, if you're cornered—" "I'll ensure she escapes," Rollins promised. "Whatever it takes." Bennett studied him for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw in Rollins's eyes. "I believe you will. Just bring yourself back too, if possible. I suspect Clara has developed a certain regard for your welfare." Before Rollins could respond to this unexpected observation, Clara returned, now dressed again in her Cheyenne attire, practical buckskins that would blend with the winter forest far better than Eastern clothes. "We should leave within the hour," she announced. "The moon sets at midnight, giving us optimal darkness for the approach." As they made final preparations, Mrs. Larson knocked softly at the door. Her normally composed features showed obvious distress. "Riders coming down the street," she reported tensely. 6 men, heavily armed. Marshal Foster is leading them." Rollins moved to the window, carefully peering past the curtain. The town marshal and his deputies were conducting a methodical search, going door to door along the street. They're checking every building, he observed grimly. Someone talked. Simmons, Bennett suggested. Rollins shook his head. Not willingly, but he may have been followed or someone overheard him making contacts. What do we do, Mrs.? Larson asked her Scottish brogue, thickening with anxiety. Is there a cellar? Rollins asked. Yes, but they'll search it for certain. The stable, then. We'll hide in the hayloft until they've gone. Mrs. Larson nodded. Go now. I'll delay them as long as possible. They gathered only the most essential items, weapons, the document satchel, and minimal supplies. Clara hesitated over the maps, but Rollins shook his head. Leave them. If they find evidence we've been studying the dam site, they'll increase security there. They slipped out the back door and across the small yard to the stable. The building was dark and smelled of hay and horses, a comfortingly familiar environment to Rollins after years of campaigning. He led them up the ladder to the hayloft, where they concealed themselves beneath loose hay near the back wall. Minutes later, they heard Mrs. Larson's voice greeting the marshal with convincing indignation at the late-night intrusion. Foster's gruff responses carried clearly in the night air as he insisted on searching the premises. Sooner we clear this place, sooner we move on, the marshal was saying. Got orders to check every building in town. And what exactly are you looking for at this hour? Mrs. Larson demanded. Fugitives, 3 of them, man and woman traveling with a gunman. Wanted for theft and fraud in Cheyenne. The fabricated charges were predictable, but effective. Few townspeople would risk harboring known criminals, particularly with the weight of the marshal's authority behind the search. Heavy boots thumped through the boarding house below. Drawers opened and closed, furniture scraped across wooden floors. Rollins tensed as the stable door creaked open, a lantern's glow spilling across the earthen floor below. Check them stalls, Foster ordered. And the tack room. A deputy moved methodically through the small stable, checking each stall. Rollins silently drew his Colt, noting that Clara had done the same with her small derringer. Above them, the deputy's lantern cast grotesque shadows against the stable walls. Nothing here, Marshal, the man called after completing his inspection. Check the loft, Foster instructed from the doorway. Rollins met Clara's eyes in the dimness, a silent communication passing between them. If discovered, they would have seconds to decide between surrender and violent resistance, a choice with no good outcome. The ladder creaked as the deputy began to climb. The hay rustled as Clara shifted her position slightly, bringing her derringer to bear on the emerging figure. A sudden commotion from the street interrupted the search shouts and the crash of breaking glass, followed by gunshots. "Marshal, we got trouble at the saloon," someone yelled. "God damn it," Foster cursed. "Jackson, get down here. Search the rest later." The deputy descended hastily, and moments later the stable door slammed shut as the lawmen rushed toward the disturbance. Rollins waited a full minute before moving, ensuring they weren't leaving a man behind to watch the stable. "What happened?" Bennett whispered. "Diversion," Rollins surmised. "Question is, was it for our benefit, or did Wade arrange it to draw the marshal away from here? Either way, we should go while we have the chance," Clara urged. They descended carefully and peered out the stable door. The street was empty near the boarding house, but a crowd had gathered 3 blocks away in front of the saloon, where a brawl appeared to have spilled out onto the boardwalk. "The confusion works in our favor," Rollins decided. "But we can't take Mrs. Larson's horses now. They'll be missed immediately, and she'll be implicated." "The livery stable is at the south end of town," Clara recalled. "We could borrow mounts from there." Bennett looked troubled. "That's theft, Clara." "Survival," she corrected. "We'll return them when possible." Rollins made the decision. "South livery it is. We'll skirt the back alleys and avoid the main street." They moved through the darkness with the cautious efficiency of hunted prey, using shadows and buildings for cover. The disturbance at the saloon had drawn most of the town's attention, leaving the southern section relatively deserted. As they approached the livery stable, Rollins held up his hand, halting their progress. "Something's wrong. No guard." The livery door stood partially open, the interior dark and silent. Under normal circumstances, even at this hour, someone would be on duty to assist late arrivals or early departures. "Wait here," Rollins instructed, drawing his Colt. He approached the building alone, senses alert for any sign of ambush. The interior of the stable was unnaturally quiet. No shuffling of restless horses, no soft nickering at his entrance. He struck a match, illuminating a scene that confirmed his worst suspicions. The stalls were empty. Every horse was gone. He retreated quickly to where Bennett and Clara waited. "Hayes has cleared out the livery. All the horses are gone." "The other stables," Bennett suggested. "Likely the same," Rollins concluded grimly. "He's stranding us in town, cutting off any means of escape." "It's a hunting technique," Clara observed. "Contain your prey in a limited area, then tighten the circle until they have nowhere left to run." The accuracy of her assessment sent a chill through Rollins. Hayes was indeed hunting them, using the town itself as a trap. Without horses, they couldn't reach the dam site, couldn't escape to Iron Wolf's camp, couldn't even make a run for the territorial border. "We need to get off the streets," he decided. "Find somewhere defensible to regroup." "Where?" Bennett asked. "They've found the boarding house, and they'll search every hotel and public building." Clara's expression shifted as an idea formed. "Not every building. The undertaker's establishment at the edge of town. Simmons mentioned the proprietor, Mr. Sullivan, lost his mining claim to Hayes last year. An undertaker with a grudge." Rollins considered the possibility. "Risky, but we're short on options." They changed direction, moving northeast through back alleys toward the town's small cemetery. Sullivan's establishment, a modest clapboard building with a workshop and living quarters attached, sat at the boundary between civilization and the great beyond, both literally and figuratively. As they approached through the cemetery, Rollins noted a single light burning in the back room. He motioned for Bennett and Clara to wait while he reconnoitered, circling the building to check for guards or traps. Finding none, he knocked softly at the back door. After a moment, it opened a crack, revealing a thin-faced man of about 50, holding a shotgun with the practiced ease of a frontiersman. "Who comes calling at this ungodly hour?" the man demanded. "Friends of Reverend Simmons," Rollins replied quietly. "In need of sanctuary." Sullivan's narrow face revealed nothing. "The Reverend has many friends." "And many enemies," Rollins countered, "particularly one who took your claim at Sulphur Creek." The undertaker studied him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in, then. Quickly." Once inside, with Bennett and Clara joining them, Sullivan secured the door with multiple locks. The room was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean, with the faint smell of chemicals underlying the more pleasant aroma of coffee brewing on the stove. "You're the ones they're hunting," Sullivan observed without preamble. "The whole town's in an uproar. Hayes has offered $500 for information leading to your capture." "Generous price for 3 fugitives," Clara noted. "Too generous for simple fugitives," Sullivan agreed shrewdly, "which suggests you have something Hayes wants very badly indeed." Bennett nodded toward the document satchel. "Evidence of his crimes. Enough to send him to prison for 20 years. Sullivan poured coffee into tin cups, his movements precise and economical. "I assumed as much when Simmons contacted me an hour ago. Said you might need assistance, though he didn't expect it quite so soon." "Simmons reached out to you?" Rollins asked, surprised. I serve on the church board, Sullivan explained. And as he mentioned, I have my own reasons to see Hayes answer for his misdeeds. He handed them each a cup of strong black coffee. Now, how can I be of service to your cause? We need transportation, Rollins explained. Hayes has removed the horses from all public stables. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. Not surprising. He controls the town through isolation, decides who comes and goes, what news arrives, what supplies are available. Can you help us? Clara pressed. Perhaps. Sullivan sipped his coffee. I maintain a wagon and team for my professional duties. Hayes has never interfered with my business. Even tyrants respect the fellowship of death, it seems. A hearse? Bennett looked dubious. A multi-purpose conveyance, Sullivan corrected with professional dignity, suitable for transporting the deceased, or the living, who wish to avoid notice. Rollins considered the possibility. A funeral wagon would attract less attention than riders, especially if traveling north toward the reservation. The Indians bury their own, Clara pointed out. True, but mixed bloods and converts are sometimes brought to town, Sullivan countered. I've made the journey before without raising suspicion. The plan had merit, Rollins decided. They could conceal themselves in Sullivan's wagon travel to the dam site under the guise of retrieving a body and gather the evidence they needed. As they discussed details, a soft knock at the front door interrupted their planning. Sullivan raised a cautionary hand and moved silently to the window, peering carefully past the curtain. Marshal Foster, he reported grimly. And he's not alone. Rollins moved to the window for a better view. Foster stood on the front porch with two deputies, while others could be seen positioning themselves around the building. How did they find us so quickly? Bennett whispered. Clara's expression darkened with sudden realization. Simmons, if he contacted Sullivan, someone could have followed him. Or Simmons betrayed us directly, Rollins finished. The possibility had to be considered, though it seemed unlikely given the Reverend's obvious sincerity. Sullivan gestured toward a door at the rear of the room. My workshop. There's a trap door beneath the preparation table that leads to a root cellar. It's small, but it should conceal you temporarily. And if they insist on searching thoroughly, Rollins asked. The Undertaker's thin lips curved in a mirthless smile. Then I shall be appropriately offended at their desecration of my professional sanctuary. Few men are comfortable challenging an Undertaker in his domain. As Foster's knocking grew more insistent, they moved quickly into the workshop, a clinically clean room dominated by a large wooden table and cabinets filled with the tools of the mortician's trade. Sullivan rolled back a rug, revealing a trap door built flush with the floorboards. Quickly now, and be silent, no matter what you hear above. The space below was indeed small, barely 6 feet square, and 4 feet high, originally designed for storing root vegetables in the days before the building became an Undertaker's establishment. The three of them crowded into the darkness, pulling the trapdoor closed above them, just as Sullivan greeted the marshal in the front room. This is most irregular, Marshal. Sullivan's voice carried faintly through the floorboards. A professional establishment, such as mine, operates on the principle of discretion and respect. Save it, Sullivan, Foster responded gruffly. I've got orders to search every building in town, no exceptions. On what authority? I see no warrant. Emergency powers. 3 dangerous fugitives are believed to be in Rock Creek. Now step aside or I'll have my men remove you. Heavy boots thumped across the floor above as the deputies spread through the small building. Rollins tensed as footsteps entered the workshop directly overhead. The preparation table scraped slightly as someone examined it. Nothing here, Marshal, a deputy called after a cursory inspection. Check underneath, Foster instructed from the doorway. "And move that rug." Clara's hand found Rollins's in the darkness, her fingers cold but steady. Bennett's breathing had quickened, though he remained admirably silent. The rug rolled back above them. Footsteps approached the trap door. "What's this?" the deputy asked. "Root cellar," Sullivan answered smoothly. "From when this was a residence. I use it for storage now." "Open it," Foster ordered. "I must protest, Marshal. I have sensitive materials stored below." "Open it or I'll break it open." A tense silence followed. Then Sullivan's resigned sigh. "Very well, but I warn you the contents are professionally confidential." The trapdoor creaked as Sullivan knelt to open it. Rollins drew his Colt, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. In the confined space, they stood no chance against multiple armed men, but he would ensure Bennett and Clara had at least an opportunity to surrender rather than die in a shootout. Light spilled into their hiding place as the door lifted. Sullivan's face appeared in the opening, his expression professionally somber. "As you can see, Marshal," he said, stepping back to allow Foster a view, "nothing but my special preparations." Rollins froze, momentarily confused. The cellar appeared empty from Foster's vantage point, yet he and his companions were clearly visible from Sullivan's perspective. "What the hell is that smell?" Foster demanded, recoiling slightly. "Embalming chemicals," Sullivan explained. "I store them below to maintain proper temperature. The fumes can be disorienting to those unaccustomed to them." Foster peered suspiciously into the opening, his gaze seeming to pass directly over the three fugitives without registering their presence. "Close it up," he ordered after a moment. "Damn smell is making my eyes water." The trapdoor closed, plunging them back into darkness. Footsteps moved away, followed by Sullivan's voice, expertly guiding the lawmen toward the exit, with professional courtesy, masking obvious relief. When the front door finally closed and silence descended on the building, Clara's grip on Rollins's hand tightened. "What just happened?" she whispered. "I don't know," Rollins admitted, equally mystified. The trapdoor opened again several minutes later, revealing Sullivan's thin face. "They've gone," he reported. "It's safe to come up now." As they emerged, Rollins confronted the undertaker directly. "How did he not see us? We were right there in plain sight." Sullivan smiled enigmatically. "Were you? Don't play games," Rollins warned. "What happened?" In answer, Sullivan reached to a shelf and retrieved a small glass bottle containing a clear liquid. "Vapor lamp," he explained. "A theatrical device I modified for my specific purposes. When heated, the solution creates a momentary bending of light, what some might call an illusion." "A magic trick?" Bennett asked incredulously. "Applied science," Sullivan corrected. "I learned it during the war working with the Signal Corps, useful for making certain messages visible only to the intended recipient." Clara studied the bottle with obvious fascination. "And Foster couldn't see us because you weren't there from his perspective." Sullivan replaced the bottle carefully. "The effect is brief and imperfect, but sufficient to confuse an already uncomfortable man eager to be elsewhere." Rollins reassessed the undertaker. "You're more than you appear, Mr. Sullivan." "As are we all, Captain Rollins." Sullivan's smile faded. "But our clever escape only delays the inevitable. Hayes will eventually search every inch of this town. You need to leave Rock Creek tonight." "Without horses?" Bennett asked. "With my hearse," Sullivan decided. "We'll depart in 1 hour, ostensibly to retrieve a body from the Indian settlement near the dam construction. The guards know me, they won't search a funeral wagon too carefully." "It's risky," Rollins cautioned. "If they recognize any of us—" "Life is risk, Captain," Sullivan replied philosophically, particularly when confronting men like Maxwell Hayes. As Sullivan began preparations for their journey, Rollins stepped outside briefly to survey the town. Rock Creek had fallen quiet again, the excitement at the saloon apparently concluded. Yet he sensed watchful eyes in the darkness. The town had become a web with Hayes at its center, feeling every vibration. Clara joined him, her breath clouding in the cold night air. "We've lost our safe haven here," she observed. "Even if we gather evidence at the dam site, we can't return to Rock Creek." "No," Rollins agreed. "Once we have what we need, we'll need to push directly for Cheyenne. Federal authorities are our only hope now." A 200-mile journey through hostile territory in winter. "I've made longer marches with fewer resources." He glanced at her profile silver in the moonlight. "Though I usually had an army at my back, not 2 civilians." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "I'm more capable than you think, Captain." "I'm counting on it." Rollins turned to face her fully. "Because I suspect the worst is yet to come. Hayes isn't just protecting his business interests anymore. This has become personal for him." "As it has for you," she observed quietly. The comment struck uncomfortably close to Rollins's private thoughts. Wade's revelation about Sarah and James had transformed his motivation from abstract justice to burning personal vendetta, despite his protest to Reverend Simmons. "Yes," he admitted finally, "but I won't let that cloud my judgment. We need evidence, legal process, legitimate authority, not frontier justice." "And if those fail?" The question hung between them, laden with implications. In the civilized East, law and order prevailed through institutions and processes. But here on the frontier, justice often came from the barrel of a gun when all other recourses failed. Before Rollins could answer, Sullivan appeared at the door. "The wagon is ready," he announced. "We should leave now while the town sleeps." As they prepared to depart, Rollins found himself studying Bennett and Clara with newfound concern. He had drawn these people into his personal war against Hayes and Wade, a conflict that grew more dangerous with each passing hour. The lawyer and his daughter had their own reasons for fighting their own stake in the outcome, but ultimately Rollins had become responsible for their safety. The weight of command settled onto his shoulders again as he helped Clara into the funeral wagon's hidden compartment, a burden he had thought left behind in the blood-soaked fields of Virginia. Only this time, failure meant more than military defeat. It meant the destruction of everything and everyone he had allowed himself to care about once more. And as Sullivan's hearse rolled quietly out of Rock Creek toward the looming darkness of the northern forests, Ethan Rollins silently vowed that this time he would not fail. Whatever the cost, Hayes and Wade would answer for their crimes against the law, against the innocent, and against the family that had been stolen from him in the name of greed and power. The hearse moved slowly through the night, its black-draped exterior melding with the darkness. Inside the concealed compartment, Rollins, Bennett, and Clara sat in cramped silence, the rhythmic creak of wheels and occasional snort of horses, the only sounds breaking the quiet. Sullivan handled the reins with practiced precision, maintaining a steady pace along the rutted trail leading north from Rock Creek. Dawn was still hours away when Sullivan halted the wagon in a small clearing sheltered by ponderosa pines. He rapped twice on the compartment wall, the signal that it was safe to emerge. Rollins climbed out, first muscles stiff from the confined space. The air was bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Mountains loomed as darker shadows against the star-strewn sky. "We're 8 miles north of town," Sullivan reported quietly. "No sign of pursuit so far." "How much farther to the dam site?" Rollins asked, orienting himself by the stars. 4 miles, as the crow flies. But we'll need to leave the wagon here." Sullivan gestured toward the increasingly rugged terrain ahead. The trail narrows through the pass. A hearse would be conspicuous, and the horses couldn't manage it anyway. Bennett emerged from the compartment, helping Clara after him. "We'll proceed on foot, then." "Yes," Rollins decided. "Sullivan, you should return to Rock Creek before your absence is noted." The undertaker shook his head. "Too late for that. By now Hayes knows I've helped you. My establishment will already be under watch, if not seized outright." "We've cost you your livelihood," Clara said with genuine regret. Sullivan smiled thinly. "Miss Bennett, I've buried too many victims of Hayes's ambitions to mourn my own small sacrifice. This territory needs men like your father and Captain Rollins far more than it needs another undertaker." As they gathered supplies for the trek ahead, Sullivan unrolled a crude map sketched on butcher paper. "The dam construction site is here." He indicated a point where the North Fork of Powder River narrowed between rocky outcroppings. "Hayes has 30 men working in shifts, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter." "What about the mine entrance?" Clara asked. "If it exists, it would be here." Sullivan's finger moved to a spot slightly upstream. "There's an old shaft from the '68 strike supposedly played out. According to rumors, it collapsed after a flash flood, killing 3 miners." Rollins studied the map with tactical assessment. "Approaching from the west gives us the best cover pine forest and boulder fields. We'll need to reach an observation point before full daylight." "I know a place," Sullivan offered. "A ledge overlooking the site. I've delivered supplies to the Cheyenne who monitor Hayes' activities." Clara looked up sharply. "You've been helping my uncle's people." "In small ways. Medicine, ammunition, information." Sullivan shrugged. "Hayes isn't the only one who can form alliances." They cached the hearse in a dense thicket, unhitching the horses and securing them with enough lead to graze. If they didn't return, the animals would eventually break free. But for now, they needed transportation for the journey ahead. With Sullivan guiding them, they set off through the forest, moving as silently as possible over the snow-crusted ground. Rollins took point, while Bennett, despite his age and urban background, kept pace with surprising determination. Clara moved with the natural stealth of someone raised in both worlds, her buckskin clothing blending with the forest shadows. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they climbed steep slopes, covered with loose shale, narrow ledges, above dizzying drops, dense pine thickets that tore at clothing and skin. Sullivan led them on a circuitous route that avoided the main trails clearly familiar with the hidden paths used by the Cheyenne. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, they reached Sullivan's promised vantage point, a rocky shelf screened by junipers offering a commanding view of the valley below. What they saw confirmed their suspicions and exceeded their worst fears. The dam construction was far more extensive than the plans had indicated. Heavy timber frameworks spanned the river gorge with a massive earthen barrier already diverting part of the flow. Dozens of Chinese laborers worked by torchlight despite the early hour, supervised by armed overseers. But it was the activity half a mile upstream that captured their attention. A mining operation partially concealed by canvas screens, but unmistakable. Ore carts moved along rails from a tunnel entrance, while a stamping mill crushed rock with rhythmic booms that echoed through the valley. "Gold mining on reservation land," Bennett whispered, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "A federal crime under 3 separate treaties." Clara adjusted the field glass Rollins had handed her. "Look at the guards. Those aren't common thugs, they're wearing cavalry uniforms." Rollins took the glass, confirming her observation with growing unease. "Former military, at least. Too disciplined for hired guns." He focused on a tall figure directing operations near the mine entrance. "Wade!" Even at this distance, his former friend was unmistakable. the ramrod posture, the distinctive way he gestured when giving orders. Wade supervised the operation with military precision, his presence explaining the discipline Rollins had noted among the guards. "We need documentation," Bennett said. "Sketches, samples if possible." "I'll go," Clara volunteered immediately. "Too dangerous," Rollins countered. "Wade knows your face. Not like this." She gestured to her Cheyenne clothing and darkened complexion. "In this light at a distance, I'd be just another Indian woman invisible to men like Wade." Rollins wanted to argue, but her assessment was tactically sound. White men in the West developed a peculiar blindness to indigenous people unless they represented an immediate threat. A lone native woman might pass unnoticed where any white observer would immediately draw attention. "Take this," he said finally, handing her a small Kodak camera Sullivan had brought, a recent innovation compact enough to conceal in a leather pouch. One clear image of the mining operation with the dam construction visible would be worth 1,000 witness statements. "I'll need a distraction," Clara said, studying the patterns of the guards below. "Something to draw attention away from the eastern approach." Sullivan pointed to a supply depot on the opposite side of the camp. "Blasting powder for the mining operation. A small fire there would create considerable confusion." "Without endangering the Chinese workers," Bennett insisted. Rollins considered their limited options. "Sullivan and I will create the diversion. Bennett, you stay here as lookout. Clara, you'll have 15 minutes at most to get close enough for photographs, then retreat to the rendezvous point we passed a half-mile back." They synchronized their pocket watches and reviewed the plan once more. Clara would circle east, using the river's edge for cover. Once in position, she would wait for the diversion before approaching the mine entrance for documentation. If separated, they would regroup at the cached hearse by midday. As Clara prepared to depart, Bennett embraced her briefly. "Be careful," he murmured. "Always, Father." Her smile held confidence, but Rollins caught the flicker of concern in her eyes as she melted into the forest with practiced silence. 30 minutes to get into position. Rollins and Sullivan began their own approach from the western flank, using the construction equipment and supply piles for cover. Bennett remained at the observation point field glass trained on the operation below. The descent was treacherous, loose shale that threatened to trigger miniature avalanches, with each step exposed areas where they would be visible to sentries. They moved with agonizing slowness, freezing in place whenever guards passed nearby. As they neared the supply depot, Sullivan touched Rollins's arm, pointing to a sentry station they hadn't observed from above, 2 guards with Winchester rifles positioned to overlook the very approach they were taking. "We need another way," Sullivan whispered. Rollins studied the layout, identifying a drainage culvert that ran beneath the guard position. "Through there. It'll be a tight fit." The culvert proved even narrower than it had appeared, barely 18 inches in diameter, half filled with icy runoff from the slopes above. They crawled through the frigid water, emerging mud-covered but undetected behind a stack of timber. From this position, the supply depot was just 30 yards away, a canvas-roofed structure containing barrels of blasting powder tool crates and coils of fuse wire. 2 drowsy guards stood at the entrance, more concerned with staying warm than maintaining vigilance. "We need a precise distraction," Rollins murmured. "Enough to draw attention without causing real damage." Sullivan reached into his coat, producing several small glass vials. "Chemical compounds," he explained at Rollins's questioning look. "Theatrical effects for funerals. Combine them properly, and they create impressive smoke with minimal fire risk." "Undertaking seems a profession of many talents," Rollins observed dryly. "The dead keep few secrets, Captain," Sullivan replied with his characteristic gallows humor. "The living, however, require more creative management." Their plan formulated quickly. Sullivan would create a diversion at the far end of the camp smoke and noise sufficient to draw the guards' attention, while Rollins planted similar compounds near the blasting powder timed to ignite several minutes later. As Sullivan slipped away toward his position, Rollins checked his pocket watch. Clara should be in place by now, waiting for their signal. Precisely on schedule, a commotion erupted at the north end of the camp, billowing green-tinged smoke accompanied by sharp cracking sounds like distant gunfire. Guards ran toward the disturbance, workers paused in confusion, and Wade's voice carried clearly across the site, barking orders to maintain positions. In the ensuing chaos, Rollins darted toward the supply depot, planted Sullivan's compounds behind several powder kegs, and retreated to their planned extraction route. 3 minutes later, as he rejoined Sullivan in the cover of a boulder field, a second series of explosions and brilliant multicolored smoke erupted from the supply depot. The effect was spectacular, frightening, but largely harmless, creating maximum confusion with minimal danger to the workers. "Theatrical indeed," Rollins commented as they climbed toward the rendezvous point. "You've missed your calling, Sullivan." "Perhaps," the Undertaker acknowledged, "though in my experience the dead make a more appreciative audience than the living." From their elevated position, they could see the camp in disarray, guards running in multiple directions, Wade attempting to restore order, workers taking advantage of the confusion to rest. And at the edge of the chaos, a small figure in buckskins slipped between the mine entrance and the river, documenting everything with quick efficiency. Clara was performing her role perfectly, nearly invisible amid the general confusion. Rollins allowed himself a moment of admiration for her courage and competence before focusing on their own escape. They needed to reach the rendezvous point before the camp security reorganized. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a rifle shot cracked from somewhere to their left. Sullivan stumbled, clutching his side. "Go on," he gasped, blood seeping between his fingers. "I'll only slow you down." Rollins ignored the instruction, hauling the Undertaker behind a fallen log as more shots splintered bark around them. "Where are you hit?" "Clean through lower ribs." Sullivan's breathing was labored but controlled. "Seems my theatrical career will be shorter than anticipated." Peering carefully around their cover, Rollins spotted two figures working their way up the slope toward them, guards who must have been patrolling farther out than expected. He fired twice, forcing them to cover, but their position remained precarious. "Can you move if I support you?" he asked, reloading his Colt. Sullivan nodded grimly. "For a time. Though I suspect my final performance approaches, Captain." "Save the curtain call," Rollins replied, helping him to his feet. "We're not finished yet." They made agonizing progress through the forest, Sullivan weakening with each step, despite his stoic silence. Behind them, pursuit organized shouts and occasional shots, indicating the guards were following their trail through the snow. When they finally reached the rendezvous point, a lightning-struck pine that formed a natural landmark, neither Bennett nor Clara had arrived. Rollins settled Sullivan against a tree trunk, fashioning a pressure bandage from his own shirt, despite the bitter cold. "You should continue on," Sullivan insisted, his face gray with pain and blood loss. "Miss Bennett and her father will need your protection." "We leave together, or not at all," Rollins said firmly, the soldier's creed so deeply ingrained that it transcended mere words. Sullivan smiled faintly. "Still the honorable officer even after all these years." He coughed a wet sound that concerned Rollins more than the wound itself. "May I ask a personal question, Captain?" "Ask." "After all Hayes has taken from you, your wife, your child, nearly your ranch, why do you insist on legal justice? Why not simply put a bullet in him and be done?" The question struck at the heart of Rollins's internal struggle, one He'd been battling since Wade's revelation about Sarah and James. "Because a bullet would be too quick," he answered with brutal honesty. "And because men like Hayes and Wade hide behind a perversion of law and order. Defeating them on their own terms, exposing them through legitimate authority, that's a more complete victory than any act of personal vengeance." Sullivan nodded slowly. "A righteous man's answer. I hope you maintain that conviction in the days ahead." Before Rollins could respond, movement in the underbrush brought him around, Colt raised. Clara emerged breathing hard, her leather pouch clutched protectively. "We have to move," she said without preamble. "Wade's organized search parties. They're—" She broke off, noticing Sullivan's condition. "How bad?" "Bad enough," the undertaker answered for himself. "Though I find a certain irony in requiring my own professional services." Clara knelt beside him, examining the wound with practiced hands. "The bullet passed through cleanly, but you've lost too much blood for travel." "My assessment exactly," Sullivan agreed. "Which is why you three must go on without me." "We're not leaving you," Rollins insisted. "You must." Sullivan's voice strengthened with conviction. "I'm dying, Captain. We both know the signs. Even if you carried me, I wouldn't survive to reach help." Clara met Rollins's eyes, her expression confirming Sullivan's assessment. The undertaker had perhaps hours, not days, and moving him would only hasten the inevitable. "My father?" Clara asked, glancing around the clearing. "Hasn't arrived," Rollins answered. "Did you see him during your approach?" She shook her head, concern etching lines around her eyes. "We separated when the diversion began. He was heading west toward the rendezvous." A grim possibility settled over them. Bennett should have reached the meeting point long before either of them. His absence suggested capture or worse. Sullivan seemed to read their thoughts. "Go," he urged. "Find Bennett. The evidence you've gathered must reach federal authorities, whatever the cost." The sound of pursuit grew, closer voices calling to each other through the forest, the crash of men moving without concern for stealth. They had minutes at most before discovery. Clara opened her pouch, showing Rollins the camera. "I got what we needed. Clear images of the mining operation, the dam construction, and Wade overseeing both. With the documents we already have." "It's enough," Rollins confirmed. The evidence would withstand legal scrutiny, proving Hayes's criminal enterprise beyond any reasonable doubt. Sullivan fumbled at his waistband, producing a Remington Derringer. "Leave me this," he requested. "I'll delay them as long as possible." The unspoken implication hung between them. Sullivan would sell his life dearly, buying them time to escape a final service to their cause. Rollins clasped the undertaker's hand. "It's been an honor, Mr. Sullivan." "Likewise, Captain." Sullivan's grip remained surprisingly strong. "Remember what we discussed. Justice, not vengeance, makes the difference between men like you and men like Hayes." Clara bent to kiss Sullivan's forehead, a gesture of respect that seemed to momentarily transcend the undertaker's professional detachment. "We'll make sure your sacrifice matters," she promised. They left him there, propped against the pine with his Derringer concealed beneath a folded blanket. The last Rollins saw of Patrick Sullivan was the undertaker checking his weapon with the same meticulous care he'd likely given to every professional task throughout his life. They moved east away from the immediate pursuit planning to circle back toward the cached hearse once they'd broken their trail. Clara led the way, her Cheyenne heritage evident in how she navigated the difficult terrain with instinctive efficiency. "We need to find my father," she said when they paused briefly for breath. "He wouldn't abandon the rendezvous unless something prevented him." "Agreed," Rollins said grimly. "But we need to be smart about it. If he's been captured, rushing in blindly won't help him. Clara's expression hardened. If Wade has him, the implication needed no elaboration. Edward Wade had demonstrated his ruthlessness repeatedly. If he held Daniel Bennett, the lawyer's life expectancy could be measured in hours, not days. As they climbed a ridge that offered better visibility, a distant gunshot echoed through the valley, a single report followed by silence. Sullivan's final act of defiance, Rollins surmised, feeling a renewed respect for the Undertaker's courage. From their elevated position, they could see search parties combing the forest below, at least 20 men spread in a systematic pattern that revealed Wade's military training. The dam construction and mining operation continued unabated, suggesting that whatever had occurred hadn't been deemed serious enough to halt work. There, Clara pointed toward the camp's eastern edge. Is that a wagon? Rollins focused his field glass on the area she indicated. A canvas-covered wagon had arrived, surrounded by mounted guards. As they watched, a figure was escorted from the camp headquarters toward the vehicle, a man whose bearing Rollins recognized instantly. Bennett, he confirmed, adjusting the glass for a clearer view. Alive, but under guard. Clara reached for the glass, her hand trembling slightly. Where are they taking him? Back to Rock Creek, most likely. Wade would want him securely held for questioning. Her jaw set with determination. Then we follow. We can't abandon him. We won't, Rollins assured her. But we need to be strategic. They'll expect pursuit, and they'll be watching for it. They retreated from the ridge, planning their approach. The wagon would follow the main trail back to Rock Creek, a route too exposed for them to attempt direct interception. However, Rollins knew the terrain offered alternatives. There's a parallel valley that runs south, he explained as they moved. Rougher travel, but it intersects the main road at Cottonwood Creek, 5 miles from town. We could get ahead of them, set up an ambush. Clara nodded, her expression grim but focused. Just the two of us against however many guards they send. Quality over quantity, Rollins replied with the confidence of experience, especially when the enemy doesn't know where or when you'll strike. They pushed themselves hard through the difficult terrain, knowing every minute counted if they were to reach the interception point before Bennett's wagon. The journey became a grueling test of endurance, scrambling down rock faces, fording icy streams, fighting through dense underbrush. Clara matched Rollins pace for pace, never complaining despite the punishing conditions. Only when they paused briefly to refill canteens at a spring did she reveal the toll it was taking. "My father isn't well," she said quietly, washing trail dust from her face. "He has a heart condition. The stress of captivity, any rough treatment." Rollins understood her unspoken fear. "Bennett is valuable to Hayes, a potential hostage against our actions. They'll keep him alive." For how long? Once they realize we have the evidence. The question hung unanswered between them. Hayes and Wade operated on a brutal calculus of self-interest. Bennett's value as a hostage would last only as long as they believed they could salvage their operation. "We'll reach Cottonwood Creek before sunset," Rollins promised, "and we'll get your father back." They continued south, the winter sun offering little warmth as it tracked across the sky. By mid-afternoon, they had covered nearly 10 miles of punishing terrain, bringing them within striking distance of their objective. Cottonwood Creek formed a natural choke point on the trail to Rock Creek, a place where the road narrowed between rocky bluffs, forcing travelers to slow as they crossed the shallow ford. It was the perfect location for an ambush, as generations of indigenous warriors had demonstrated before them. Rollins scouted the area thoroughly, identifying firing positions and escape routes. They had perhaps an hour before the wagon would arrive, assuming it maintained a steady pace from the dam site. As they prepared their ambush, Clara revealed a hidden talent constructing primitive but effective deadfalls and trip lines from forest materials skills learned from her Cheyenne relatives. "These won't stop determined men," she explained, setting a spring-loaded branch that would release a shower of stones onto the trail. "But they'll create confusion, make them hesitate." Rollins nodded approvingly. "Hesitation is all we need. A few seconds' advantage can determine the outcome." They worked in efficient silence, each recognizing the other's capabilities without need for explanation. It struck Rollins how quickly they had developed this wordless coordination, as though they had been fighting together for years rather than days. With their preparations complete, they settled into concealed positions overlooking the ford. Rollins checked and rechecked his weapons, the Colt revolver, Winchester rifle, and hunting knife that comprised his personal arsenal. Clara did the same with her father's Spencer carbine, her movements precise and practiced. The waiting was always the hardest part. The tense silence before action, when doubts and second thoughts had time to surface. Rollins had experienced this countless times during the war, the peculiar clarity that came with knowing violence approached on a schedule. "May I ask you something, Captain?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Go ahead." "After this is over, assuming we succeed, what will you do?" The question caught him off guard. Rollins had been so focused on bringing Hayes and Wade to justice that he'd given little thought to what might follow. "Rebuild Lone Pine, I suppose," he answered after a moment's consideration. "Return to ranching." Alone. The simple word carried layers of meaning that Rollins wasn't prepared to address. Since losing Sarah and James, he had built his life around solitude, avoiding attachments that might become vulnerabilities. Yet these past days had forced him back into human connection with Bennett, with Sullivan, and most unexpectedly with Clara herself. Before he could formulate a response, the distant sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves reached them. Rollins raised his field glass, confirming their target approached a canvas-covered wagon with 4 mounted guards moving at a steady pace toward the ford. 4 riders plus the driver, he reported quietly. Bennett is inside the wagon, likely restrained. Clara checked the Spencers' action one final time. "Can you see who's leading them?" Rollins adjusted the glass, focusing on the lead rider. "Not Wade. One of his lieutenants, the man with the scarred face we saw at the camp." "Chambers," Clara identified him grimly. "Former Army scout dishonorably discharged for killing prisoners. He's Wade's executioner when dirty work needs doing." The presence of such a man guarding Bennett confirmed their worst fears. This wasn't merely a prisoner transport, it was potentially a mobile execution site away from witnesses. "Change of plans," Rollins decided. "We need to take them at the water crossing, not after. Hit them hard and fast before they reach the far bank." Clara nodded her understanding, shifting position slightly to better cover the ford. The approaching wagon had slowed as it descended toward the creek, exactly as Rollins had anticipated. "On my shot," he instructed. "Take the driver first, then work from left to right. I'll handle Chambers and the rear guard." The wagon entered the water horses, splashing through the shallow ford. Rollins drew a deep breath, centered his sight on Chambers, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of his Winchester shattered the afternoon stillness. Chambers jerked in the saddle, clutching his shoulder, as Clara's shot dropped the driver with deadly accuracy. The remaining guards reacted with commendable speed, drawing weapons and scanning for threats, but the carefully planned crossfire gave them no safe position. Within seconds, 2 more guards fell. The last man standing attempted to reach the wagon, perhaps to secure Bennett or use him as a shield, but Clara's final shot caught him squarely as he grabbed for the canvas flap. "Move!" Rollins ordered, already sliding down the slope toward the creek. They approached the wagon cautiously, weapons ready. Chambers lay motionless in the creek face down in the crimson-tinged water. The other guards were down, but potentially still dangerous. Rollins secured each fallen man with battlefield efficiency, confirming 2 dead, 1 dying, and 1, including Chambers, merely wounded. Clara headed straight for the wagon, calling her father's name with uncharacteristic emotion, breaking through her controlled exterior. The canvas flap opened, but it wasn't Daniel Bennett who emerged. Edward Wade stepped down into the creek, a Colt Army revolver pressed firmly against Bennett's temple. "Hello, Ethan," he said calmly, as though greeting an old friend at a social gathering. "I've been expecting you." Time seemed to freeze in the frigid waters of Cottonwood Creek. Rollins stood motionless, Winchester half-raised, as Wade pressed his revolver against Bennett's temple. The lawyer's face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but his expression remained defiant, despite the clear exhaustion in his posture. "Lower your weapons," Wade commanded. "Both of you." Clara kept her Spencer trained steadily. "Release my father first." "That's not how this works, Miss Bennett." Wade's voice carried the calm authority that had once led men into battle. "Drop your weapons, or I put a bullet through the lawyer's brain. I won't ask twice." Rollins assessed the situation with cold precision. Wade stood partially shielded by Bennett, offering no clean shot. The distance, perhaps 15 yards, made a disarming shot too risky with a handgun, and the Winchester's higher caliber would pass through Wade into Bennett. "Clara," Rollins said quietly, "do as he says." She glanced at him sharply, anger and desperation warring in her expression. "Trust me," he added, meeting her eyes with deliberate intensity. After a moment's hesitation, Clara slowly lowered her Spencer. Rollins followed suit with his Winchester. "Excellent," Wade nodded approvingly. "Now, kick them away and show me your hands." They complied, sending their rifles skittering across the rocky creek bed. Rollins kept his hands visible at shoulder height, but his mind raced through options, assessing and discarding possibilities with tactical efficiency. "You were always the reasonable one, Ethan," Wade observed, maintaining his grip on Bennett, "unlike some of our more impulsive colleagues." "What do you want, Edward?" Rollins kept his tone conversational, buying time. "A simple exchange. Bennett for the evidence you've collected." Wade's eyes flicked to the leather pouch at Clara's side. "Those documents, and whatever else you've gathered at the dam site." "And then what?" Rollins asked. "We walk away and pretend none of this happened." Wade smiled thinly. "You know better than that, but I'm offering Bennett a chance to live. The alternative should be obvious." Clara took a half-step forward. "If you kill him, you'll never get the evidence." "Perhaps," Wade acknowledged, "but Hayes has men searching Sullivan's wagon as we speak. It's only a matter of time before they find whatever you've hidden there." The casual mention of Sullivan sent a cold shiver through Rollins. The Undertaker's sacrifice had been in vain if Wade had already located their transportation. "Besides," Wade continued, "killing Bennett is merely my opening move. I have 20 men approaching from the south. Your position here is already compromised." It was almost certainly a bluff. Wade wouldn't have confronted them alone if reinforcements were truly imminent, but Rollins couldn't discount the possibility entirely. Their tactical situation deteriorated with each passing minute. "The pouch," Wade instructed Clara. "Slide it across the creek, slowly." Clara hesitated, looking to Rollins for guidance. The leather satchel contained their only evidence of Hayes's operation. Photographs, documents, everything they'd risked their lives to obtain. Without it, they had nothing but unsubstantiated accusations against the most powerful man in the territory. Bennett suddenly spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "Don't do it, Clara. The evidence is more important than my life." Wade pressed the revolver harder against the lawyer's temple. Noble but foolish. You have 10 seconds to decide, Miss Bennet. The evidence or your father's brains in the creek. Wait, Rollins interrupted, sensing Clara's imminent capitulation. I have a counter-offer. Wade raised an eyebrow, momentarily curious. I'm listening. Me, Rollins said simply. Let Bennet go, and I'll surrender myself. Hayes wants me more than he wants Bennet. I'm the one who can identify Wade at Sand Creek. I'm the one who ended your military career. A flicker of genuine emotion crossed Wade's face, the first crack in his professional demeanor. An interesting proposition, but inadequate without the evidence. You'll get the evidence too, Rollins continued, but only after Bennet and Clara are safely away. Captain, no, Bennet protested weakly. Clara stared at Rollins with a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and something deeper he couldn't fully interpret. Wade considered the offer, visibly calculating odds and outcomes. You always were one for dramatic sacrifices, Ethan. But what guarantee do I have that Miss Bennet will actually surrender the evidence once her father is safe? My word, Rollins replied, which meant something to you once. The reference to their shared past struck home. For a brief moment, Rollins glimpsed the man Wade had been before corruption and brutality hollowed him out, the brilliant young officer whose friendship had sustained Rollins through the war's darkest days. Your word, Wade repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that was always your currency, wasn't it, honor and obligation? While Wade's attention focused on this philosophical exchange, Rollins noted Clara shifting her weight subtly, her right hand drifting toward her boot. She caught his glance and stilled immediately, but he'd seen enough to understand her intention. The small derringer she kept as a final defense if she could draw it unnoticed. Very well, Wade decided. A partial exchange. Bennet walks to his daughter. Once they're together, you come to me. Then we negotiate the evidence. It was the best offer they were likely to get. Rollins nodded agreement. Release him. Wade loosened his grip on Bennet, lowering the revolver slightly. Walk forward, counselor. Slowly. Bennet moved with painful deliberation, each step clearly agonizing. Whatever injuries he had sustained in captivity, they were more severe than his stoic demeanor suggested. Halfway across the creek, Bennet stumbled, falling to one knee in the icy water. Wade tensed, revolver rising, but the lawyer pushed himself upright with visible effort and continued toward Clara. The moment Bennet reached his daughter, Rollins began his own advance toward Wade. Each step felt leaden, the cold creek water seeping through his boots, but his mind remained sharply focused. Wade believed himself in control of the situation, a tactical advantage Rollins had exploited countless times during the war. As he neared the midpoint where Bennet had stumbled, Rollins noticed something half-submerged in the creek bed, a glint of metal partially concealed by silt and water. Bennet hadn't stumbled by accident. He'd dropped something for Rollins to find. Without breaking stride, Rollins adjusted his path slightly, positioning his next step directly over the object. As his boot covered it, he felt the unmistakable shape of a Derringer. Bennett's hidden backup weapon, likely missed during his capture due to its small size and ankle holster. That's far enough, Wade called when Rollins was still 10 feet away. On your knees, hands behind your head. Rollins complied, sinking to his knees in the frigid creek. The icy water soaked through his trousers, but he welcomed the discomfort. It sharpened his focus, clearing away any hesitation. Now, Miss Bennet, Wade addressed Clara without taking his eyes off Rollins. The evidence, if you please. Clara clutched the leather pouch protectively. My father first. Let him reach the bank. Wade's patience visibly thinned. You're not in a position to make demands. Actually, she is. Bennett said, his voice stronger than before. Kill me, kill Rollins, and the evidence still reaches federal authorities. Clara made arrangements in town before we left. It was a desperate bluff, but delivered with a lawyer's practiced conviction. Wade hesitated, reassessing the situation. In that moment of uncertainty, Rollins made his move. Lunging forward, he scooped the submerged derringer from beneath his boot, bringing it up in one fluid motion as he rolled to the side. Wade reacted with the instincts of a combat veteran, swinging his revolver toward the unexpected threat. His first shot kicked up water inches from Rollins's head. The derringer's report was almost comically small compared to Wade's Colt, but at 15 feet, its effectiveness was undiminished. Rollins's bullet struck Wade in the right shoulder, spinning him sideways and sending his next shot wild. Clara's Spencer cracked from behind Rollins. She had reclaimed her rifle the instant the shooting started. Her bullet caught Wade in the thigh, dropping him to one knee in the creek. Disarmed and wounded, Wade still maintained his military bearing. Blood seeped through his coat, staining the creek water crimson around him, but his eyes remained coldly calculating. "Finish it, Ethan," he said quietly. "We both know that's how this ends." Rollins approached cautiously, Derringer still trained on his former friend. "It doesn't have to." "Doesn't it?" Wade grimaced in pain, but his voice remained steady. "What's your alternative? A trial where all our dirty laundry gets aired? The Army won't thank you for exposing one of their officers as a murderer of women and children." "This isn't about the Army," Rollins replied. "It's about justice for Sarah and James, for the Cheyenne at Sand Creek, for every person you and Hayes have destroyed in your pursuit of wealth and power." Wade laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Justice? There's no justice in this world, Ethan. Only power and those brave enough to seize it." He glanced toward Bennett and Clara on the bank. "Ask her, ask the Harvard-educated lady, what justice means to someone who watched her mother die at Sand Creek." Clara stepped forward, Spencer still trained on Wade. "Justice means you face the consequences of your actions, Major. Not through revenge, but through law, the same law you perverted to serve your ambitions." "Noble sentiments," Wade sneered. "But we both know Ethan wants to put a bullet in my head for what happened to his family. Don't you, old friend?" The temptation pulsed through Rollins with almost physical force, the simple, clean finality of ending Wade here in the creek, washing away years of pain with a single trigger pull. "You're wrong," Rollins said, finally lowering the derringer slightly. "I want you to live, Edward. I want you to stand trial. I want every filthy secret you and Hayes have buried to be exposed to the light of day." Wade's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool. Hayes has judges in his pocket all the way to Denver. You'll never get a conviction." "Perhaps not," Bennett interjected, leaning heavily on Clara for support. "But the evidence doesn't just implicate you and Hayes. It implicates territorial officials, Army procurement officers, even a senator's mining interests. Too many powerful men to protect with simple bribery." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, the first hint of genuine uncertainty. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Bennett smiled grimly. "Why do you think I came west myself instead of sending agents? Some conspiracies are too big for local authorities to handle." Wade processed this information with visible calculation. His gaze shifted between them, assessing until it finally settled on Rollins. "What happens now, Captain?" he asked, military formality returning to his tone. "Now we take you to Cheyenne," Rollins answered. "Along with the evidence, you'll receive medical attention, a fair trial, and whatever sentence the court deems appropriate." Wade nodded slowly, then, with startling suddenness, lunged toward his fallen revolver. Rollins reacted instantly, but Clara's shot came first. A clean hit that took Wade in the center of his chest, throwing him backward into the creek. He lay half-submerged, blood blossoming across his shirt, eyes wide with surprise. "Clara!" Bennett cried out in shock. She lowered the Spencer, her expression unreadable. He was reaching for his weapon. Rollins splashed through the creek to Wade's side. The wound was mortal. The bullet had struck just below the sternum, likely tearing through vital organs. Wade wouldn't survive long enough to reach medical attention, even if it had been immediately available. "You should have taken the shot, Ethan," Wade gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "More merciful than hanging." "I'm not here to offer mercy, Edward," Rollins replied quietly. "Just justice." Wade's bloodied hand suddenly gripped Rollins's coat with surprising strength. "Hayes knows," he whispered urgently. "About the woman. About what she really is." "What are you talking about?" Wade's eyes were already glazing, life ebbing rapidly. "Clara Bennett died in Boston 3 years ago. Consumption. The woman with you is an imposter, a half-breed playing a role." His final words came as barely a breath. "Nothing is what it seems, Ethan. Nothing." The hand on Rollins's coat went slack. Major Edward Wade, once the pride of the 12th Pennsylvania, stared sightlessly at the winter sky, secrets dying with him in the frigid waters of Cottonwood Creek. Rollins rose slowly, Wade's final words echoing in his mind. He turned toward the bank where Clara stood beside her father, the Spencer rifle still gripped in her hands. "He's gone," Rollins announced simply. Bennett closed his eyes briefly, a complex emotion crossing his features. Clara's expression remained carefully neutral, but Rollins noticed her knuckles whitening around the rifle stock. "We need to move," she said practically. If Wade was telling the truth about men approaching from the south— "He wasn't," Rollins interrupted, studying her with new intensity. "But he did say something else. Something about you." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Whatever lies Wade told in his final moments, he said the real Clara Bennett died in Boston 3 years ago." Rollins continued, watching her reaction carefully. "That you're an imposter." Bennett stepped forward protectively. "Captain, this is hardly the time." "Is it true?" Rollins persisted, addressing Clara directly. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze level and unflinching. Then, with deliberate care, she leaned the Spencer against a boulder. "Yes and no," she admitted finally. "The woman known as Clara Bennett Daniels' adopted daughter did die in Boston. Tuberculosis, not consumption, but the outcome was the same." "Then who are you?" Rollins asked, though he had already begun to piece together the truth. "My name is Morning Star," she replied, straightening her shoulders with quiet dignity. "Clara Bennett was my half-sister. Same father, different mothers. Daniel adopted us both after Sand Creek me from my mother's people, Clara, from a Boston orphanage." Bennett sighed heavily. "When Clara died, Morning Star took her place. Her education, her connections, her position in society. It was the only way to continue our work, exposing the corruption on the frontier. A white woman's identity opened doors that remained closed to a half-breed," Morning Star explained, using Wade's slur with bitter irony. "Even one with Harvard education and impeccable manners." Rollins absorbed this revelation, reevaluating every interaction since they'd met. "Does Iron Wolf know?" "Of course," Morning Star nodded. "He helped arrange it. The deception was necessary to gain access to Hayes' organization." And the documents the evidence is that real? Rollins asked. Every page, Bennett confirmed. The fraud is personal, Captain, not professional. The cause remains just. Rollins considered this distinction, recognizing the moral complexity of their situation. Morning Star had assumed a false identity, yet her purpose remained honorable, exposing crimes that would otherwise go unpunished due to prejudice and corruption. We should recover the rifles and search Wade's body. Rollins decided pragmatism overriding philosophical concerns. Then we need to reach Cheyenne as quickly as possible. The immediate crisis resolved, they worked efficiently to salvage what they could from the ambush. Wade carried orders from Hayes confirming the illegal mining operation, along with a military-issue compass and a pocket watch Rollins recognized. With a jolt, it had belonged to a lieutenant in their old regiment, a man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances after questioning Wade's conduct. The wagon's intact, Morning Star reported after inspecting their unexpected acquisition. With fresh horses, we could reach Cheyenne in 3 days. 2 if we push hard, Rollins corrected, helping Bennett onto the wagon seat. The lawyer was weakening visibly, his injuries and exhaustion taking a mounting toll. As Morning Star prepared the team, Rollins took a moment to study their surroundings. Cottonwood Creek continued its eternal flow, indifferent to the violence that had stained its waters. Wade's body lay where they had dragged it, partially covered by his own coat, a soldier's minimal tribute to a fallen enemy. Somewhere to the north, Sullivan's mortal remains awaited a similar improvised dignity. And in Rock Creek, Maxwell Hayes continued his operations, unaware that his carefully constructed empire stood on the precipice of destruction. "Captain," Morning Star called from the wagon. "We're ready." Rollins climbed aboard, taking the reins from her hands. "Rest with your father. I'll drive the first stretch." As they pulled away from Cottonwood Creek, leaving Wade's body to the elements, Rollins found himself reflecting on the twisting path that had led him here. 3 weeks ago, he had been a solitary rancher, intentionally isolated from the world's complexities. Now he was entangled in a web of corruption, identity, and justice that stretched from Wyoming to Washington. And beside him sat a woman whose very existence challenged everything he thought he understood about appearance and reality. The journey to Cheyenne proved even more arduous than anticipated. Winter storms forced detours through treacherous mountain passes. Bennett's condition deteriorated, fever setting in, despite Morning Star's skilled nursing. Twice they spotted riders on distant ridgelines, Hayes' men searching for them, necessitating further delays as they concealed themselves until the pursuit passed. Throughout these trials, Morning Star revealed depths of resourcefulness and courage that continually impressed Rollins. She hunted game when their provisions ran low, treated Bennett's wounds with native medicines when conventional remedies failed, and maintained unwavering focus on their mission despite exhaustion and danger. On the 4th evening, as they camped in a sheltered ravine, Bennett's fever broke at last. He awakened clear-headed for the first time in days, accepting broth from Morning Star's hands with grateful acknowledgement. "We'll reach Cheyenne tomorrow," Rollins informed him. "Judge Williams is expecting us. Iron Wolf sent a runner ahead with basic information." Bennett nodded weakly. "Good. Williams is one of the few honest jurists in the territory." He studied Rollins thoughtfully. "You've done more than I had any right to ask, Captain." "I made a promise," Rollins replied simply, "to a stranger based on nothing but principle." Bennett smiled faintly. Such men are rare in any era, but particularly in these cynical times. Later, as Bennett slept, and Morning Star took first watch, Rollins found himself unable to rest. He sat by the small, carefully shielded fire, memories of Sarah and James surfacing unbidden. For years he had nurtured his grief like a precious thing, allowing it to define his existence. Now, with Wade dead and Hayes soon to face justice, he confronted an unexpected void. "What will you do afterward?" Morningstar asked softly, echoing her question from days earlier. "When this is finished," Rollins prodded the embers thoughtfully, "rebuild Lone Pine, I suppose. Hayes's men did considerable damage." Alone. The question carried the same weight as before, but this time Rollins was better prepared to consider its implications. "That depends," he said carefully, "on whether certain people might have reason to visit Wyoming territory in the future." Morningstar studied him across the fire, her expression thoughtful. "Some might, for the right reasons." "Professional or personal reasons?" Rollins asked, venturing into territory as uncertain as any wilderness he had traversed. "Perhaps both." She smiled slightly. "The territory could benefit from a lawyer who understands both worlds, white and indigenous. And such a lawyer might appreciate the perspective of a rancher with similar understanding." The possibility hung between them, tentative, undefined, but undeniably present. Not romance precisely, but something equally meaningful: mutual respect, shared purpose, and the potential for a partnership that transcended conventional boundaries. "I would welcome such visits," Rollins said finally. "Lone Pine has always had room for growth." Morningstar nodded, accepting this cautious invitation for what it was. "We should rest. Tomorrow will test us all." Cheyenne in winter presented a stark contrast to the primitive conditions of the trail. Gas lamps illuminated broad streets where freight wagons and elegant carriages navigated through crowds of miners, cowboys, businessmen, and soldiers from the nearby fort. The territorial capital embodied the frontier's transformation, raw wilderness yielding incrementally to Eastern civilization with all the contradictions such change entailed. Judge Thaddeus Williams received them in his chambers at the courthouse, a dignified man in his 60s, whose stern countenance softened considerably upon seeing Bennett's condition. "Daniel, my old friend," he greeted the lawyer with genuine concern. "You look like something the coyotes dragged in." "I feel considerably worse, Thaddeus," Bennett admitted with a weak smile, "but I've brought you something worth the journey." Morningstar placed the leather satchel on the judge's desk. "Everything is here, Your Honor. Documents, photographs, witness statements, all organized chronologically." Williams examined the evidence with methodical thoroughness, his expression darkening as he grasped the full extent of Hayes's operation. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Water rights violations, land fraud, illegal mining on reservation territory, and military complicity." He looked up sharply. "Major Wade was involved directly." "He's dead," Rollins stated flatly. "Killed resisting capture at Cottonwood Creek." "Unfortunate," Williams mused. "His testimony would have been valuable. Still, these documents bearing his signature." He tapped a particular page. "This alone justifies immediate action." "Hayes has considerable influence," Bennett cautioned, "even here in Cheyenne." "Indeed he does," Williams agreed grimly, "which is why I'll be telegraphing the federal marshal's office in Denver immediately. This case requires external authority beyond Hayes's reach." The judge rose. "Decision made. Captain Rollins, I'll need your sworn statement regarding Wade's activities. Miss Bennett." He paused, glancing at Morningstar with subtle recognition that suggested he knew more than he acknowledged. "Your documentation of the mining operation is particularly compelling. The photographs alone would convince any jury." "What happens now?" Rollins asked. "Now," Williams said, reaching for his coat, "I issue warrants for Hayes' arrest and the seizure of his assets." Federal marshals should arrive from Denver within 3 days. In the meantime, you three will remain under protection at my residence. Hayes still has resources, and if he learns of your presence in Cheyenne, the implication required no elaboration. Hayes's reach was long, and desperate men took desperate measures. "One more thing, Judge," Bennett said, producing a sealed envelope from his coat. "This contains my full statement regarding Sand Creek, including Wade's involvement and subsequent cover-up. It names officers still serving who participated in the massacre." Williams accepted the envelope with visible reluctance. "You understand the political ramifications of such accusations?" "Perfectly," Bennett nodded. "But truth and justice cannot be subordinate to political convenience. The Cheyenne deserve acknowledgement of what was done to them." "Very well." Williams tucked the envelope into his desk drawer. "I'll ensure it reaches the proper authorities." As they departed the courthouse under escort, Rollins noticed Morning Star watching him with quiet intensity. "What is it?" he asked. "You kept your word," she replied. "When most men would have sought personal vengeance, you chose justice through law. Does that surprise you?" She considered the question thoughtfully. "No, it confirms what I believed about you from the beginning. You're a man of principle, Captain Rollins. Rarer than gold in these territories." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted down the street, shouts, running feet, and the ominous crack of gunfire. Their escorts immediately moved to defensive positions, shielding them from potential danger. "What's happening?" Bennett demanded, leaning heavily on Rollins's arm. A deputy sheriff came running toward them, face flushed with excitement. "Judge Williams' telegram from Rock Creek Hayes is dead." "Dead," Williams repeated sharply. "How?" "Shot by his own men," the deputy reported breathlessly. "Word came that federal authorities were investigating. He tried to flee with the mining proceeds, and his lieutenants turned on him." The deputy shook his head in amazement. "They're fighting among themselves now for control of his operations." The news rippled through their small group with varying impact. Bennett received it with judicial detachment, Williams with pragmatic assessment of its implications for their case. Morning Star's expression revealed complex emotions, satisfaction, tempered by the recognition that Hayes had escaped formal justice. For Rollins, the news struck with unexpected hollowness. He had pursued Hayes relentlessly, driven by the need to avenge Sarah and James. Now that pursuit had ended not through his own actions, but through the banal treachery of common criminals. "Justice takes many forms," Morning Star said quietly, reading his thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "Sometimes through courts, sometimes through consequence." "Is it justice?" Rollins wondered aloud. "Or merely an ending? Perhaps both," she suggested. "The important question is what begins now." As they continued toward Williams's residence, that question resonated through Rollins's consciousness. What did begin now? With Hayes dead and Wade gone, the immediate battles were won. The evidence would still expose the broader conspiracy, bringing some measure of justice to the Cheyenne and other victims. Lone Pine Ranch could be rebuilt, perhaps even expanded, but those were external matters, actions and outcomes in the physical world. The deeper question concerned what began within himself. For years, Rollins had defined his existence through loss and isolation. Now, those foundations had shifted, revealing possibilities he had long denied himself. Later that evening, as Bennett rested and Williams worked on the legal proceedings, Rollins found Morning Star on the judge's back porch, watching the sunset paint Cheyenne's rooftops in crimson and gold. "You never answered my question," he said, joining her at the railing. "About what you'll do when this is finished." She smiled slightly. Because I haven't decided. The world offers different paths to Morning Star than it did to Clara Bennett. And which name will you use going forward? Neither, perhaps. She turned to face him fully. I've lived between worlds my entire life, Captain. Perhaps it's time I created my own identity rather than adopting someone else's. Ethan, he corrected gently. If we're discussing new beginnings, Captain belongs to the past. Her smile deepened, reaching her eyes for perhaps the first time since they'd met. Ethan, then. They stood in comfortable silence as darkness claimed the town gas lamps flickering to life along the streets below. The Wyoming winter stretched before them, harsh and unforgiving, yet somehow less threatening than it had seemed mere weeks ago. I meant what I said about Lone Pine, Rollins said finally. There's room for growth, room for new possibilities. Morning Star nodded, understanding the invitation beneath his careful words. I'd like to see it again, when spring comes, when the land awakens. It wasn't a promise exactly, more an acknowledgement of potential, a seed planted that might, with proper nurturing, grow into something neither of them could fully envision yet. For now, that possibility was enough. Far to the north, beyond Cheyenne's civilized boundaries, the Powder River continued its eternal flow through the wilderness. The dam construction had already been abandoned, the Chinese laborers scattering to other opportunities. Iron Wolf's people had returned to their ancestral lands, at least temporarily, while territorial authorities sorted through the aftermath of Hayes's downfall. And at Lone Pine Ranch, snow covered the graves of Sarah and James Rollins, preserving them in winter's embrace, until spring brought renewal once more. They would always remain a part of Ethan Rollins's story, the foundation upon which his life had been built. But perhaps they need not define its conclusion. As stars emerged above Cheyenne, Ethan Rollins contemplated a future no longer constrained by vengeance or isolation. Whatever path Morning Star ultimately chose, whatever name she claimed as her own, their shared journey had transformed them both. The West remained unbowed, wild, complex, and contradictory. But within its harsh beauty, even the most wounded souls could find unexpected healing, and the most solitary hearts might discover connections worth nurturing. For a man who had once defined himself through loss, that possibility represented the greatest justice of all. End of Part 5. Story complete.